We are certainly pleased to have you here at this centennial birthday commemoration in recognition of General Lewis B. Hershey's distinguished service to his country. We are proud to, at Tri-State University, to have General Hershey as our alumnus. Gentlemen, you may be seated. Between 1984 and 1990, I served as the chief academic officer at this institution, and in June and July we bring new students to the campus and together with their parents put them in an auditorium where I had an opportunity to give them a welcome. And being a historian, I always like to look over at this building and point out to them that on June 17 in 1884 there was an assemblage on the second floor of this building, and that summer classes began. And that on May 17, 1 month earlier, my grandmother was born. And then I would pause and I'd say, both are doing fine. And always the parents did that, and the students kind of looked at me sort of funny. Well, Lewis Hershey attended classes in this building. It certainly wasn't as it looks now. This building has new parts. Grandmother only made it to 1989. If they'd given her new parts, I'm sure she'd still be doing well also. My wife buys more things at antique stores and flea markets than I make. She out there somewhere. I'm only kidding. Okay. She once found this postcard. And so I'm going to pass this around the audience. I hope it doesn't distract our speaker. But as you see this postcard, it's from a female student to a friend of hers in Wabash, urging her to come visit her. And as you look at this campus, you can imagine that you're Louis Hershey coming from the east to the west with your books in hand, ready to do business with your instructors. This is Tri-State College when Louis Hershey was here. Now, it's not true that Glenn Radcliffe was here as Professor Hershey's instructor, but Glenn Radcliffe, as many of you know, served this campus long and in just about every capacity that there is. And we're proud to have him as a professor emeritus, and we're proud to introduce him now to give an invocation.
I didn't start the university. I came here a year after it was started. Let us all be reverent in the spirit of prayer just now. Almighty God, we're here today to remember a friend, a devoted and a dedicated United States citizen. And as one biographer says of him, the homespun earthy Hoosier, one who faithfully served his country as a member of the United States Army, one who gave much to many, moving up through the ranks to that of a four-star general. And then on November the 3rd, 1969, the United States Senate confirmed his promotion to full General Army of the United States. Our friend walked with men in high positions, both in American and foreign countries. He received many awards. And to speak of a personal friend, General B. Hershey, that's what we're talking about. One who never forgot where his roots were firmly planted in Jamestown Township, Steuben County, Indiana. His contribution to friend and loved ones alike were wide and colorful. He leaves a beautiful memory. His philosophy would be well for many, including each one here today, to emulate. He was proud of one. He was proud of his heritage. And Lord, we thank you for the General Army of the United States, Louis Blaine Hershey. Amen.
We're very pleased to have here this afternoon with us from his home in Spring Mills, Pennsylvania, the chairman of our Board of Trustees, Dr. William Getty. Dr. Getty is a graduate of Tri-State University mechanical engineer. Dr. Getty.
Thank you, Jim. Honored guests, friends of the university, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our campus today. I'm fortunate enough to have this honor to welcome you for such an illustrious alumnus, because our president is now winging his way to Scandinavia to bring some students to this campus. When he asked me if I would stand in for him today, I was greatly honored. And I hope that you enjoy this afternoon as much as I will in reminiscing and thinking about probably the most noted and notable Tri-State alum that's ever trod the campus. So I thank you very much for coming. I look forward to enjoying the afternoon along with you. And thank you again for helping us celebrate General Hershey's birthday today. 100th birthday. Am I right? Right. I have been associated with General Hershey, but I think the letter said greetings, as I recall. And that was a long time ago, and I quickly enlisted in the Navy. So I'm a World War II guy. I recognize here on the Marine a few bars here. We used to have Marines on the battleship. but they weren't too happy. I don't think they wanted to get into the fray, and they were kind of parading around the ship taking care of the admiral. But in any case, I'm very happy to see someone here who may have been in World War II. I don't think there's too many here that have been. Thank you very much.
Our speaker this afternoon, George Flynn, is no stranger to many of you in the audience. A graduate of Louisiana State University and currently professor of history at Texas Tech University, Professor Flynn has devoted much of his scholarly work to the biographical study of General Hershey and to the workings of the Selective Service system. Among his several articles and books on Hershey and Selective Service is Louis V. Hershey, Mr. Selective Service, and most recently, published just this year, The Draft, 1940-1973. I might add, for the benefit of the military persons in the audience, that Professor Flynn was assigned to the adjutant, notice I stumble when I say that, being a former military person, Adjutant General Corps of the United States Army from 1964-1966, and he served as a captain in the reserves in 1966 and 1968. Professor Flynn.
This isn't working, so we'll ignore that. Well, I thank you very much for inviting me, and I thank Professor Zimmerman and Dr. Ratliff and Dr. Getty for having me as part of this program. It's a pleasure for me to be here because I come from a regular academic year in which I have to face 300 freshmen sometimes who aren't really interested in whatever I'm saying. But you're all here and you're interested in hearing about this, so it's my pleasure. And I hope that sometime I'll get a chance to see that little postcard that's going around. It's a local postcard, it's not a French postcard. I'm sure that there'll be plenty of people here who will be able to correct some of the details of my remarks, since I used them for the information initially, and I probably got it wrong, but afterwards we can discuss where I went wrong, all right? The keynote speaker is supposed to sort of set an occasion for a convention. As we know, though, many people use a keynote address to launch their own political career. But there is an essential issue, it seems to me, when we try to understand Louis Hershey and his contributions to American history. And I think service is the term that we could latch on to, not just selective service, but national, international service, universal service to the country and to his fellow man. And so I'm going to examine briefly, in 30 minutes hopefully, a career that spanned several decades and 6 presidents, and ended here in Angola on the 20th of May 1977, as though he sort of completed a circle. He began here and he came here and died. And 100 years ago today, he was born on a farm and raised by his father, Latta Fraley Hershey, and his mother, Rosetta Richardson Hershey. She died when he was still very young, and before he entered school, in fact. Now, one of the strengths of this country, I suppose, is that you can't really predict where you're going to get leadership from, and this isn't the most likely area in the country to produce a man who's going to be the mobilizer of military manpower in the 20th century. But I guess the general would disagree with me. He would say that actually it was this land in this rural area that gave him the values that made his leadership possible. And what did he get out of his young career here in northeastern Indiana that proved so valuable in his later career? Well, it certainly wasn't farming, because he couldn't get away from that fast enough. He escaped the family farm as soon as possible. After graduating from Fremont High School in 1910 in a senior class of less than a dozen students, he attended Tri-State here and obtained a teaching certificate. He did this in the summer, and he was teaching elementary school then, and he re-entered Tri-State and supported himself by working as a deputy sheriff. His father was sheriff of the county at the time. And he played basketball here at Tri-State. In those days, you couldn't support yourself by playing college basketball, so he had to have another job. But by 1914, he had earned 3 different bachelor's degrees from this institution in science, arts, and pedagogy. And I think what he got out of all this, of course, was an enormous confidence in his ability as a student, because I remember when I came here to look at his academic record, and I was very impressed with it. He performed admirably as a student in all subjects, math and education, English. He was an A student. So he came out of that with confidence in his intellectual ability. Undoubtedly, working as a deputy sheriff gave him confidence, too, in the ability to handle problems. So he came out confident of his ability to function in our society. And from 1914 to 1916, he served as principal of a high school, Flint High School, in the area. But his leadership skills, I think, were also honed by membership in the Indiana National Guard. And in 1916, he enlisted, and rapidly his unit was federalized to march down to the Mexican border and protect us Texans against those dangerous Mexicans who were threatening us at that time. But during his career in the National Guard, he was elected to first lieutenant. In those days, they elected their officers. So this spoke to the recognition of his ability by his peers. Well, after several months fighting the mosquitoes and boredom in southern Texas, where I can reliably report people are still fighting mosquitoes and boredom, he had plans for obtaining a graduate degree in education from Indiana University in Bloomington. And he did enter IU and begin his studies. Unfortunately, America entered World War I at that time, which had begun, of course, earlier, but we didn't get in until 1917. And he left the dorms in Bloomington to serve as a first lieutenant in Battery C of the 137th Field Artillery Unit, and went into training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. He seems to have visited some very wonderful places during his military career. But while at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, he married Ellen Dygat, who was his childhood sweetheart, and would remain at his side for almost 60 years, from rural Mississippi to receptions in the White House. She died in April of 1977. To his disappointment, Hershey did not see combat in World War I. He was promoted to captain in October 1917, and he arrived in France just as the war was ending. But he extended his tour for 11 months to see a bit of the world, and he did travel throughout Europe. He worked mainly at Brest, France, dreadful weather. But one of the things that obviously occurred to him was that he quite liked the military life. He liked the companionship, the male bonding, the responsibility. All of this appealed to him. And the opportunity to operate on a larger theater, a national or an international theater, was something that also had its appeal. So it was quite clear to him by that time that he was not coming back to northeastern Indiana to enter education. He was going to remain in the service if he could. And there was every reason to expect that he could, because his reports, his efficiency reports were all outstanding. And when he returned to the United States and applied for a regular Army commission, he received it. And so on 1 July 1920, he begins his career in the regular Army as a captain. For the next 16 years, he moves from one isolated Army post to another without any promotion. He raised a family during those years, 4 children, and they're, of course, all here. And I'm sorry I didn't mention them in the beginning, but I certainly remember the hospitality of Gilbert and Catherine, and I was glad to see Ellen and George here, the children of General Hershey. And he also played polo during this period. Artillery officers at this time was mounted. In fact, of course, artillery was still mounted in World War II. German artillery was mounted, horse-drawn. But one of the things they did was they played polo with their horses. Unfortunately for Lewis, in November 1927, during a polo match, he was hit by a wayward mallet and lost his sight in his left eye. But despite this handicap, he continued his military career and went to Command General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, and then the Army War College at Pennsylvania, Carlisle Barracks, where he once again demonstrated outstanding competence in the academic aspects of the military career. And after 15 years as a captain and a short bit of duty at Fort Shafter in Hawaii, he was promoted to major in July 1935. This is not exactly an incredible progress of military advancement in 15 years, but in a peacetime army, promotions don't come very rapidly. And when they do come, of course, they come very rapidly indeed. And his promotion career would skyrocket. So if you were looking at it as a stock, it was moving very level for a long time, and then all of a sudden it explodes off the board. He was assigned in September of 1936 to the General Staff of the War Department for duty as Secretary of the Joint Army and Navy Selective Service Committee. And this really begins his career in manpower mobilization, his specialty, the thing that he will master. And this committee, the Joint Army Navy Selective Service Committee, had been established in the 1920s, the mid-1920s, by the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy. They had exchanged letters to try to continue planning for mobilization in the event of another war. In World War I, we had a draft system, a selective service system. It was run by the Provost Marshal, but after the war, it was immediately demolished, and everybody went home. But the General Staff wanted to plan in the event that there might be another war. And that's what this Joint Committee did. And as Secretary of this committee, he begins to get the experience and the knowledge that will serve him for the rest of his career. It's while working at this post that he mastered the many details surrounding this paradox that we still have trouble adjusting to, the paradox of the need to force people to serve in a democracy. And his work involved travel to every state, contact with the reserve units that had been created in the various states, and throughout he makes many contacts throughout the country. And he also began to sharpen a latent skill and political sensitivity, because he was putting together a plan, you see, that no one really wanted. I mean, this was an idea that ran counter to the whole impulse of our culture, that we would be forced to do something. It's against our libertarian instincts, our individualistic instincts, and essentially what he was doing was trying to sell the Koran in Vatican City. So it was a difficult process, and one that required considerable political tact, and continues to require that, I'm reliably told, by people trying to keep the system alive today. Well, out of this planning came eventually, of course, the Selective Service Training and Service Act of September 1940. And this bill was the conscription bill through which the United States mobilized its manpower in World War II. And, of course, it was passed before the war began, which was quite remarkable because no one expected us to adopt conscription before we actually had gone to war. We hadn't done it before. And, but it was a tribute to Hershey and also to a group of civilians who lobbied Congress for this measure. And during this time, Hershey became a regular visitor on Capitol Hill and began establishing the relationships that would serve him for the next 30 years. He became known as the expert on conscription, and he was the expert on conscription. The civilians who were also working for it had a different kind of conscription system in mind, mainly more of a universal training system, military training system, sort of a boot camp to make sure the boys knew how to make their bed and shine their shoes. But Hershey's testimony and conversations with congressmen guarantee that when the bill finally did pass, it resembled the measure that the military people had been planning since the mid-20s. Well, his knowledge was praised by everyone in Congress and by the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and so when the system was set up, he was made deputy director, and then in July of 1941, made director, and he stayed in that position until February of 1970. This was his career. How did it work out? Well, during World War II, the United States drafted some 13 million men, and it was universally praised for the operations of the draft. Both civilians and military leaders had praise for this achievement. George Gallup, who had begun his great career of feeling our pulse in 1936, had polled the Americans repeatedly during World War II on how Selective Service was doing, and he admitted, he was amazed, in fact, that the Selective Service system received such a uniformly high approval rating from American people. After all, they were taking boys out of homes, and yet mothers and fathers were still saying that the Selective Service system was fair and well run. So it was an incredible achievement to operate such a system and still maintain the public favor. So the draft was a success, and as the draft succeeded, so did General Hershey, and he was no longer a major, you'll notice, because he reached lieutenant colonel in August of 1940, and then brigadier general in October 1940. It was a very short career as lieutenant colonel, and then a major general in April 1942. And then you see this, his general rank comes rather quickly. Well, the system had to find men for the armed forces, find fighting men, but it also had to organize and run a system of deferment, because after all, the term selective service meant that not everyone was supposed to serve in the military capacity. Some people were supposed to serve in other capacities, and deferments had to be created for these people. This was a very sticky wicket, and it would always remain so. But he administered that program as well as an alternate service program for conscientious objectives, because the law had been changed to recognize this in a formal way. In World War I, it was an informal arrangement, and the military did most of the handling of COs. But in World War II, conscientious objectors were recognized, and they were allowed to perform alternate service. And Selective Service was in charge of that program, a real headache. And it was difficult to satisfy everyone in this area, but he ran the program honestly and fairly. And then finally, of course, he supervised the reemployment of veterans, because under the law, you were guaranteed a position when you came back out of the service. And he stayed in that business for a short time after the war. All through this period, his political sophistication is growing, and he becomes a master in dealing with the self-centered, sometimes narrowly focused men that we see on Capitol Hill and in the executive department. I suppose you have to be narrowly focused and self-centered if you're going to run for office and convince everyone that they should vote for you. I mean, you can't have a fragile ego and adopt that kind of political career. But it presents problems when you have to deal with these people, and he mastered the tactics necessary to deal with them. Also, civilian interest groups and the military. Of course, the military had its share of prima donnas and self-centered people, and essentially they thought that they should decide all issues during war. And he had to balance these various interests. Now, I think one key to his success in doing this was his own decided lack of what the British call side, or self-centeredness. That is, what you saw was what you got. And he was not on an ego trip in his career. He was at pains to accept blame for failure, but equally ready to attribute all credit for success to his little group of neighbors, as he referred to the local draft boards in every county in the United States. 6,000 some odd such draft boards were the ones that did the immediate work of induction. So to most politicians, Hershey had a great appeal because he was a decidedly unmilitary general, and he spoke not in the idiom of West Point or Napoleonic adages, but rather in small-town American idioms. And he was endless in his praise of the wisdom of local citizens. This went very far in Congress. After the end of World War II, the draft system continued for a short period. And after all, we did have a responsibility for occupying certain countries that had been defeated, and there had to be new people sent over to replace the boys who wanted to get home. In fact, boys who were rioting to get home. Mothers wanted them back home, but they wanted to return rapidly as well. So we had to continue the draft for a short time, but as in World War I, there was enormous pressure and desire to just end this unfortunate thing, this un-American thing of pulling young men away from their families and sending them off in uniforms to learn nasty habits in military barracks. And so it wasn't so much of a surprise that the system was eventually ended, but it did continue for a while. There was a certain irony in this tension about the continuation of the system, because at the same time that all the boys wanted to come home and all the politicians wanted to end conscription, the United States was really assuming a new position in the world, one that they had not assumed before, and that was as leader of what was to become known as the free world, or certainly the Western world. And on a rhetorical level, the United States was assuming such a position of leadership. I mean, Truman was telling Russia to shape up or expect worse treatment. He was telling the British they had to pay off their debts, the French to get their act straight. And at the same time, the American military, that is the muscle that would stand behind all of this bluster, was being degraded at a rapid rate. And so Hershey saw this contradiction and worked diligently to have the president try to make the draft a permanent part of the national defense system. But Truman, although himself a small-town American, much preferred to adopt something called universal military training. UMT had been around and would continue to be kicked around in the political arena for many years, and essentially it meant that idea of bringing the boys in and giving them some shaping up physically and teaching them how to make a bed and shine their shoes, some good hygiene, and also maybe giving them some citizenship lessons. That would never get passed, but this was Truman's idea, and he preferred that to an actual conscription into military units. Neither Congress nor the public had any interest in such an idea. So men rushed home to start families, buy homes, and go to school with funds provided by the GI Bill. Surprisingly, even the War Department preferred to end conscription and fought against Hershey's ambitions. The War Department's ambitions, of course, were to become as professional as any other profession. And it was always a source of embarrassment to some military leaders and thinkers. For example, Little Hart, a British military thinker and strategist, Captain Little Hart, was absolutely opposed to conscription in England because he felt that it degraded the professionalism of the military man. The idea that you could simply take people in and train them for 12 weeks and make soldiers out of them. I mean, his idea was that the military should be considered on the same professional level, for example, as a physician or a lawyer, someone who has taken years and years to achieve this. Right? So the military did want to go all professional certainly from 1946 on. So with all this opposition, then, it's not surprising that in March of 47, the draft law expires. However, there was a little sop thrown to the general in that an office of Selective Service Records was maintained. This was supposed to be simply an agency that was to kind of administer the dispersal of all the thousands and thousands of records that had been developed through the draft. But in fact, what General Hershey did was to use this agency to continue training reservists in the various states for what he considered to be a future use. He expected to be a future use. Well, in the meantime, Congress votes down the UMT idea. The Army discovered that, remarkably, volunteers were too scarce to man units even at reduced levels. And in Europe, of course, the Soviet Union was proving recalcitrant in its diplomatic dealings with the United States. Soon Eastern Europe was under the control of Moscow, and there was talk heard of the spread of communism throughout the world. This was brought home to many people when in February 1948, Czechoslovakia became a stool of the Soviet powers, and the civilian government was kicked out. As this happens, and by February 48, the United States Army had declined from 7.5 million in 1946 to 1.4 million in 1948. Well, we are still talking tough to the Russians, but as General Marshall would say, it's tough to talk tough when you have only one effective division that you can threaten with. Right? And so talk was then heard about renewing the draft. And in July of 1948, Selective Service was reborn as a temporary expedient. The idea was that, in fact, it was going to scare people into volunteering for the military. And draft calls were very low for the next 2 years. But in June of 1950, of course, all of this changes because North Korea invades South Korea. And President Truman sees this as a direct challenge to the United Nations, as a step in the Soviet ambitions of world conquest, and responds accordingly. And as American forces are mobilized, General MacArthur discovers that his garrison units in Tokyo are not adequate to stem North Korean T-34 tanks racing down the peninsula, and we have to, of course, strip Europe and even our reserves in the United States. And so, once again, we need lots of men, not just atomic bombs or planes. And so the draft is reinstituted. And once again, General Hershey will supervise a very smooth conscription. Now, there were some changes in the Korean War draft, but it's interesting to observe the Korean War draft because, you see, this is a limited war. It's going to be unpopular eventually. Most limited wars are popular in the beginning, but if they go on for too long, they become unpopular. And Korea became unpopular eventually as well. But we don't have the same kind of opposition to conscription during the Korean War as we see during the Vietnamese conflict, although that's another limited war. But one of the problems was that there's a rotation system. You see, in World War II, of course, you were drafted for the duration, and you served for the duration. But in Korea and then in Vietnam, you're drafted for only 2 years, and you may only serve 1 year in the zone of combat. So you had to keep replacements coming constantly. Another major problem that he had to deal with, and that was resolved rather smoothly, was the integration of the armed forces. I mean, the Selective Service system had, in fact, already ended racial tags on all of its forms even earlier. During World War II, I don't want to take too much time here, but I mean, he, in fact, had fought with the Army about ending this because it was a dreadful difficulty drafting people by race. And this had been done, of course, in World War II. But it would not be done in the Korean War. And Hershey had fought against this from the very beginning. And another new problem, of course, was conscientious objectives. No longer are they going to have alternate service run by Selective Service. They're going to arrange to work on their own. And finally, a new deferment system was put into place, one that would later cause all kinds of headaches for the system. But once again, the system received high marks from the public, the Congress, and the military. In April of 1953, the polls reported that 60% of the American public gave the draft board a high vote of confidence. So with the armistice in Korea in July of 1953, we see the same pattern repeating itself. Reduced calls on the draft, calls for ending the draft. But Hershey is able to continue his role as head of Selective Service and adopt a new mission for the system. In the period after the Korean War, he administers a deferment system to channel manpower into areas of national interest. Now, this deferment system had been designed in the Truman administration initially. Truman had been very impressed with the importance of science in winning the victory in World War II. Some people have suggested that they had won it single-handedly. And, of course, the atomic bomb had been a very impressive event and certainly illustrated the magic of science. And so the idea was that we couldn't afford to simply draft these scientists and make them riflemen. They had to be protected and allowed to design even more destructive weapons. And so we needed a system to protect them, and Hershey was responsible under a Truman mandate for developing such a system. Well, of course, he, with the flexibility that he demonstrated throughout his career, turned to the academic community for advice on how to set up such a system. What would be the best way to protect special, brainy young men? The whole idea, of course, was a violation of the notion of universal service. So it had to be done in a very delicate fashion. But there was a consensus in the academic community that you couldn't simply discriminate against physicists. You couldn't defer a physicist and not defer a historian. That seems reasonable to me. And so the idea was that we would not defer you by subject, but instead by simply ability. If you were a good history student, you were deferred as well as you were a good physics student. But the irony of this system that was designed was that it really followed the thinking very, very carefully of the academicians who were brought in, and these were some high-powered people. I mean, John Galbraith, for example, served on this advisory system, and others. And they designed the system, and everyone agreed at this meritocracy idea that these people were so potentially useful that they needed to be protected. Of course, in very short order, in the 1960s, these same academicians are going to be damning this particular system because of its discrimination, its unfairness. I mean, it's one thing to let the people stay at home when no one's being shot, I suppose. But the general had, in fact, designed the system with their advice. Now, he didn't like the idea of going away from universality, but he had to do it because of a mandate from the president, and also, very frankly, because he simply had too many 18-year-olds coming up. The demographic patterns in this country were such that by the 50s and the early 60s, we had a large number of 18-year-olds that were eligible, and at the same time, the needs of the military were declining. So what are you going to do with these people? The French are facing the same system right now. They still have what they call service national, or conscription, but they don't have any place for these people in the military. So they send them off to coach tennis and do a lot of other things. So, I mean, that's all right as long as no one's getting killed. But he understood that this was a difficult system and that it had the potential for great problems. But the draft calls remain low and the cohort of new 18-year-olds climbs. Now, in the 60s, of course, the problems with this will become manifest. With the conflict in Vietnam, Hershey found new priorities imposed by the Johnson administration. Inductions expanded, deferments now had to be cut. After a decade of liberal deferments, such a reversal provoked protests. Middle-class America began to feel the pressure of fighting a hot war in Asia. Significantly, as the draft expanded its operation, began to draft people from college, people who were not good students in college, disillusionment with the Vietnamese conflict grew, and the middle class becomes alienated. That's always a bad sign politically. Well, the general at this point was convinced that the protest against the draft, the various demonstrations that he had to be submitted to and that his local boards were submitted to, that this was all the work of a minority. And he unfortunately, I think at this point, sort of lost a bit of his touch because he played in the hands of his critics by dismissing them out of hand. And that, of course, just enraged them even further and made him more and more a target instead of Johnson or the war in Vietnam. He became an easy target because he was so visible and he was always ready with a statement about the situation. And the press, of course, would soon turn these into an agenda, and soon they had transformed the general into a sort of a monster, a symbol of an oppressive government fighting an immoral war in Vietnam. And the general was still using terms that made sense to his generation, and it made sense to the generation of World War II. But those phrases didn't make the same sense to a new group with a new agenda. President Johnson, of course, was also a target for protest, and Johnson had very little patience with these critics, and at one point after a demonstration in Washington, he directed the general, or the asked, can't we do something about these protesters, many of whom, of course, were college students and still had deferments. And the general suggested that these deferments were at the government's convenience, and it certainly wasn't a convenience to the government to have them protesting and shutting down the Pentagon. So a natural thing should be to simply remove their deferment. The trouble is that this sort of cause and effect relationship of protest and then losing a deferment smacked very, very much of abuse of government power, and that, I mean, the general did threaten to withdraw deferments from protesters, and congressmen and educators properly objected. I mean, this was not the mission of selective service to make people agree with the policies in Vietnam, but to find people for the military. In a sense, protesters, if they were violating the law, the proper situation was, of course, to use the civil courts to prosecute them. But because of Johnson's urgings, the general became involved in this particular affair, and it was very unfortunate from every point of view. Suddenly, the general, after being a master of the political situation, being praised by Republicans and Democrats alike, serving under Republican and Democratic presidents, all of a sudden becomes an issue in the 1968 presidential campaign, the last thing he wanted. Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, promised that if elected, he would certainly fire the general. Richard Nixon, the Republican, an old supporter of the general and of the Selective Service system, began to talk about the need to move to an all-volunteer force as soon as the problems in Vietnam were resolved. Well, Nixon, of course, wins the election, and the general realized that his days were numbered when this happened. Now, temporarily, of course, the system had to continue because of the needs for Vietnam. I mean, while Nixon is proceeding with his negotiations, he needs manpower to maintain his credibility in the area. So he can't act too quickly to end the draft. And certainly, Secretary of Defense Laird recommended against ending the draft. The issue, though, is that General Hershey is a political liability for President Nixon. I mean, by then, of course, the general was becoming rather advanced in his age, and his ability to relate to the youth culture was a problem. Well, of course, relating to the youth culture was a problem for anyone over the age of 40, and certainly President Johnson had his problems. But Nixon was a man, of course, that was more sensitive to these issues than many. If you ever have a chance to look at some of the Nixon papers, you'll see the Nixon White House spent 75–80% of his time on image issues, not what the substance of the problem was, but how is this going to be presented? How are we going to massage this? What kind of scenario how are we going to sell this? It was all image. And of course, the general did not have the proper image for the Nixon administration. He was candid, he spoke forthrightly, and he didn't seem to fit in with the new youth movement. And so it's not surprising that when the general resisted the Nixon reforms of the system, Nixon wanted to do two things in particular. One of the things he wanted to do was to end criticism by trying to have a national call so that every 19-year-old single male in the country would be drafted at the same time, whereas under the local board system, in some local areas, you see, they didn't have any single 19-year-olds, so they had to draft a 23-year-old. Right? And so it was an uneven distribution of calls because the local board system was decentralized. Nixon wanted a national call so that if you were 19 and single, no matter where you were going to be called before someone who was 18 and single. Or if you were 23 and single, you'd be called before someone who was married, no matter where you were in the country. Some local boards didn't have any single men. They might have to turn to married men without children. So he wanted that. But of course, that struck at the whole root of the decentralized Selective Service system, which had been the hallmark of it since it was designed, and which was what Hershey considered the strength of the system, the decentralized aspect. And so he resisted this effort by Nixon. Another thing Nixon wanted to do, of course, was to use computers. And the general also resisted this. So after a lot of false marches, eventually in February of 1970, he promoted the general to full general rank and named him presidential advisor on manpower. This meant he got an office in the executive office building and a White House phone, but it didn't ring very much. And of course, in April 1973, the Army retired General Hershey after over 50 years of service. Well, as I said before, service was a keynote. Now, when we try to establish the importance of the general in American history, and I mean, as significant as he is for Tri-State College and this community, I think that we should also try to see him in a larger context, his significance in the history of our country. I think it's clear that it rests upon his service as head of the draft system. And it was an amazing demonstration of effective service. I mean, consider that he had spanned a move from total war to limited war, from a war with artillery to a war with missiles, right? He had functioned effectively under 6 different presidents. some of whom had been born in the 19th century as he had, and some of whom had been born in the 20th century and shaped by the 20th century. And during this, he had maintained the respect and confidence of every Congress from 1940, when he first appeared as a young major, to 1970, when he defended the existing draft system in Vietnam. When Nixon was trying to get rid of him, this was a consideration, that he was universally loved and respected in Congress. So he had to be finessed out. He simply couldn't be kicked out. Well, how had he managed this? Well, I think, I'm sure that some of you have your own answers for this. Let me suggest my ideas. One is, I think, the man himself. I mean, he put forth this public image of just a simple country boy, and that's all nonsense. Of course, he was extremely intelligent and sophisticated. He was a quick study of the millions of details of manpower, induction systems in a democracy, and quite simply, he knew much more about the system than anybody in Congress around. It's amazing in the testimonies in congressional hearings that these congressmen are asking him questions, you see, that are really silly. It means that they haven't read the law, you understand? So, I mean, just by reading the law, you'd be able to finesse these congressmen, right? Most of whom, I suppose, depend upon briefings from their aides. But he simply knew the details of the law and why it had been changed, when the sentiment of Congress when it had been changed. He knew the vote and everything else. So, I mean, they simply, as Senator Javits would say, a Republican, liberal Republican would say, well, I think General Hershey knows best on any question of manpower like that. Right? And the same thing would be said by a conservative. Right? He did know more than anyone else. Another thing I think that explains his durability was the enormous support that he had throughout the country from local leadership. Many of these local leaders, of course, served in the system. Hershey cultivated local leadership. I mean, the little group of neighbors, they were neighbors, okay, but they were also influential neighbors in the various local boards, as I suppose they are today, right? I'm told from some local board members that I've met during my visit here. I mean, Hershey used to talk about this in Jeffersonian terms, that the local boards represented creative federalism. And there's some exaggeration to this because, of course, there was national policy adopted, and the local boards were supposed to follow national policy. But still, the local board system was an amazingly decentralized system, considering the tremendous move toward centralization and concentration of power in the national government. I mean, this was a great contrast that, in fact, in these local communities, people were making fundamental decisions about whether people were going to live and die, fight or not fight. And it was your neighbors who were doing it, not just a faceless bureaucrat in Washington. So that was, it was true that was a source of strength. And in a sense, Hershey was a political leader of this tremendous constituency of these local leaderships in the various communities. I mean, the party had chapters in every community in the United States, and one thing that the party agreed upon it was the absolutely indispensability of General Lewis Hershey. Now, the same kind of emphasis appeared in Congress. His stress on local autonomy, this rang church bells for congressmen, especially congressmen who were tended toward a more federalistic disposition anyway. There's also, I think, in explaining his success, his political astuteness and personal charm. Now, that seems rather paradoxical for a man whose life was dedicated to finding fighting men, men to go out and kill, as he would say, right? But, in fact, his career abounded in paradoxes. He was a four-star general who never fought in combat, an extraordinary politician who never ran for office, a military man who thought as a civilian most of the time. Above all, he had the capacity of dealing effectively with both the lowly and the mighty. He was able to speak with people from all levels and communicate effectively. He expressed his ideas and analogies and folksy stories that fit his audience. He knew how to stand fast when necessary and when to trim. He was a master communicator. And this power only failed when he was confronted with the task of communicating with the radical youth of the 1960s. I mean, the fanaticism that these people had was simply beyond even Hershey's skill, although he did try. On many occasions, he would try to communicate with them. Now, his critics in the 1960s insisted that he was not a modern man, that he had been outpaced by new values and new problems in the nation. of course, he did change. I mean, no man could remain in office for so long without adopting new methods, as he did, as Hershey did, for example, under Truman, with a deferment system, right, for the Cold War. But in some sense, of course, his critics were right. He did have a core of beliefs when he left Indiana for Europe in World War I. These beliefs were decentralized authority and preferring private to public remedies. After all, he was a lifelong Republican, right? But he also believed in what the Greeks and Romans call citizenship, civitas, a sense of responsibility, of honor to the public trust, and of duty. Now, those kinds of values brought sort of smirks to the sophisticated rebels in the 1960s. But it remains to be seen whether any civilization in this century or the next can survive the absence of these virtues from its citizenry. When Hershey left public office, he had many accomplishments to his credit. But most importantly, he kept the faith with his values, and his integrity was intact. Would that such could be said of more public officials after a much shorter tenure. Thank you very much.
Professor Flynn will be with us the remainder of the afternoon and this evening at dinner. However, he would be willing to entertain a few questions if any would like to raise some now. Do we have questions for Professor Flynn?
Okay.
The number 13 million men drafted during World War II. We've been using 10 million.
Maybe we can compromise. I think it's 13 million, but I'd have to go check, but I think it's 13 million. Okay. They didn't all serve, of course, right? Drafted. I mean, one of the problems, of course, when you talk figures, I had a little manuscript article in Scribner's New Encyclopedia on the American Military. The editors gave me all kind of problems because we have so many different figures that come down on how many people were in the Army or in the Navy at a certain time. But in the draft, of course, you get an induction notice, all right? There's so many of those that go out, right? Then there are those people that show up to take their physical, so that's another figure. And there are those that actually pass their physical, right? And those that actually serve, right? So there are all kinds of different figures, but let's not get upset with 3 million. I'll check it again, but I think it's 13 million. Okay.
As a veteran, I remember 13 million. But I think when we considered the Navy and the Marines, at the time that I entered the service, you had to enlist, you had to volunteer for the sub duty, for Marine duty, for the Navy. We were not draftees, and very proud we weren't, frankly. So I only remember 3 million people in the Navy, but I do remember the Civil Armed Services being 13 million.
One of the things about the Navy and the Marines, of course, is that they do, in fact, use the draft. You see, I mean, but what they do is they use it indirectly, in the sense that the draft frightens people into enlisting in the Navy and the Marines. Now, in World War II, Roosevelt and Secretary of Navy Knox both wanted to continue voluntary enlistment, which was creating havoc. I mean, the whole idea of having a draft was so that you could be efficient about using your manpower. I mean, we don't want this nuclear physicist rushing off to join the Marines, right, to invade Iwo Jima. And yet what's happening is that these people are enlisting in the Navy and in the Marines. So finally, the voluntary system ends. And the Army, of course, kept complaining because, essentially they were skimming off the cream, getting the best talent. So in World War II, this ends, but not in the Korean War and not in the Vietnamese War. I mean, it's possible to continue to enlist. But, I mean, Admiral Burke, for example, when I talked to him, he was CNO at one time, and he said, this draft is terrific, keep it up. I mean, we use it. It's wonderful for us, right? I mean, when the head of the Navy Reserves testified once that 75% of their enlisted ranks in the Navy Reserve were directly draft motivated, right, when they surveyed them. They asked them, why did you join? the Navy. And they said, get the draft into the Army. So how do you count that? You know, those indirect figures. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The greetings that I received included the statement that your friends and neighbors have chosen you to represent them. I wonder if that is something that Hershey phrased himself. You know.
I don't know. I mean, it's certainly at one with the sentiments that had in fact been developed by the Joint Army-Navy Committee. See, the idea was that you wanted to share this responsibility, right? I mean, this was not an agreeable idea to tell Mrs. Jones' son that, hey, we're going to take you. I mean, you know, Mrs. Jones might get upset at that. So the idea was that you shared the responsibility. This is what Hershey tried to tell Nixon, that you don't want to make this too national because then all the opposition to conscription will be directed at national figures. So make it the local people that are doing it, right? And then they take the heat, right? And what do they do when they take the heat? They say, well, Washington made us do it, right? But at least, it's a shelter belt for it. So I don't know who designed the actual wording, but the wording was critical in implementing this kind of federalistic system that was designed early in the game. And I mean, the idea was around in World War I as well, that they wanted to make the local people more responsible, but they were much more responsible in World War II than they were in World War I.
Would you comment on the present status of the draft?
Well, I'm sure that we have a couple of officials here from the system. They can tell you much more. Well, I don't think that. I mean, it seems it's remarkable that we even have it doing what it's doing. I mean, we have such an anti-military tradition in this country. I mean, an idea that the British are the same way. Of course, they gave up conscription, see? And the French have it, but it's for many different reasons. It's tied into the whole concept of the state, the revolutionary state. And we don't have that. And the idea of having any kind of conscription without a war in the United States, I think, is politically impossible. This is just speculation. But given our traditions, I don't see there's a chance of that. I mean, it came back, of course. Carter reinstituted it, and then Reagan kept it going, the registration, and I mean, Clinton hasn't appointed his own man to head up the system. That doesn't seem to me to be a very good sign of its future viability. Maybe Lou has some other ideas on that.
We'll be sharing some.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Flynn, I'd just like to elaborate on one of your comments that the local people might be interested. You said about the general losing his eye. Well, he said that his grandfather lost his eye while he was helping build the county courthouse downtown. A chip of brick hit him in the eye. And he said, I lost my eye playing polo, degeneration of the species. about conscientious objection, too. I remember him saying he put Louis Koch in as head of that because Koch was immigrant, or the son of an immigrant. He knew what it was like to be discriminated against. And he
Right.
It showed the humanism of this man.
Yes, that's right. He was very sensitive to.
One other thing, it's probably not on papers in your research, but when the general talked about the putting selective service in deep standby by making it Office of Selective Service Records, he indicated that there was a tacit agreement with President Truman that was to keep the machinery from rusting as well as to keep the records. Now this is from the general. You have other information.
Yeah. Well, I'm skeptical of that because, I mean, I did see some documents in which Truman is writing in an irritated vein that the general is doing all this training and that he's not supposed to be doing this. I mean, there were some documents in which he...
Of course, UMT was recommended by Washington by every president until modern times, and the Congress never passed it.
No, that's,
It was not politically.
right.
But I enjoyed your book, and I enjoyed your talk very much. It's just some of these little things
Yeah.
come up from personal
Sure, sure. Right. Well, send me a list of them. Maybe in the next edition. When we make the movie, we'll make those changes, all right?
We're going to get ours published first.
Okay. Oh, okay. The real story. Okay. Any other questions? Well, thanks again for inviting me. Enjoyed it very much.
On behalf of all of us, thank you, Professor Flynn. We have one more official thing that we would like to do this afternoon. Dr. Geddick has a presentation to make. Dr. Geddick.
What I've been dragged into, but did I find out?
I think it's apropos, Irene.
Thanks, and let me compliment you on the wisdom that you passed out there, and
Well-
the knowledge of it was astounding. Of course, I guess I did a little for you for a while, but you didn't
Well,
just do it yourself.
I noticed the ribbons. I have a few of those, but I pale into insignificance when I put mine on, which includes a Purple Heart, if you haven't noticed. I don't see the congressional medal, so somebody missed it.
Yeah, can't win them all.
Well, and I even want to argue a little bit with our historian. He's a little bit contemporary. You know, I notice he's younger than we are.
A lot of people are.
Because I was on the campus with a deferment in engineering, and I enlisted. So it didn't have anything to do with greed. So on behalf of the board and the university, a very small token for the importance of General Hershey, but this is from all of us here at the university in remembrance of him and his family.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to thank all the people here. I know how proud my father was of all the people he worked with, lived with, grew up with. Of course, he was a native son, as it's been pointed out by George. And I just can't thank you enough for what you've shown for him.
Yeah, and we want to thank Gil for his service to the country also, as well as having an illustrious father.
Well, thank you. Dinner will be served this evening at 5:30 at the Zollner Clubhouse. The reception that started before this event continues after this event upstairs. We also have a special exhibit of Hershey memorabilia in our library, and you're certainly invited to go over and view that exhibit. We also invite you to take another visit to the Hershey Museum. As Gil certainly remembers, his father did. Visited the museum the evening before he passed away here in Angola. On Monday, if you're still here, we have a historian from the Selective Service, Danny Johnson, who's here with us right now. You might raise your hand, Danny. And he will be giving a lecture. We call it a noon talk on our campus in Best Hall, and you're certainly invited to attend that. And how am I doing, Butch? I think the only thing I need to mention to you, for those of you that are interested in being in transportation from this end of the campus to the west end of the campus, we have transportation arranged for you, and those persons conducting that transportation are available at the library.
And the reception.
And the reception area. With that, anything else?
I want to introduce two people quickly. I think
Okay.
we'll lose one of them. So.
Fine. And then would you put
There are so many people to thank and recognize for what's happening now. Two I do want to point out right now, because I think we're going to lose one of them. The displays you're going to see were put together by two people. The original displays go back to 1971, and we heard her speak. Peggy Bush. Peggy, marvelous job organizing all this stuff. And you'll see another display that has just recently been put up, was just completed Friday, and a young lady volunteered on the campus to get involved with that. I don't know if she's going to stay with us, but Marcia Hooker, would you put your hand up? Marcia, you did a marvelous job.
We'll have opportunities for those who want to say something about their experience with General Hershey, get on video, and we hope you'll take advantage of that this afternoon in the library or this evening at dinner. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to say what's on your mind here, folks, and please continue to enjoy the festivities today at the reception, and be sure to see what's in the library and down in Hershey Hall.
Thank you, Butch, and thank you all for attending. This official.
Robert R. Hershey. I am living in Jacksonville, North Carolina. I went into the Marine Corps for early part of World War II. I was commissioned in '44 and accepted for regular commission at the end of the war. I put in 31 years service, had an active campaigns in World War II, Korea. In fact, I made 2 trips to Korea and got shot all to pieces there. And then in Vietnam, I was in Vietnam for a year commanding the 4th Marine Regiment. I retired in 1972 after 31 years of service. I have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The boy is Rose B. Hershey II. They're scattered now. As I mentioned, I live in Jacksonville. One of them lives, and one of the youngsters lives in Atlanta, Georgia. That's my oldest daughter. My son is now living in western North Carolina, which is clear across the state from where I live. I'm on the coast. But he just recently moved there. He was out in Missouri for some little time on the faculty at the university there. My other daughter, who is the middle child, she was not here for this. Unfortunately, school's just getting underway, and she's a professor in Eastern Minnesota University up in Duluth. She has 2 little children. My older daughter has 1 child. My son does not have any children at this time.
I wanted to ask you, wait, should he hold this? Is this man?
That's okay.
Okay, is that picking up? I wanted, how old were you when you went into the service?
19.
19. Did your father encourage or discourage, or whose decision was it that you...
Oh, it was mine. He certainly wouldn't have tried to force anything on it. But I think he was rather proud that I did. Is there anything else?
Yeah, and I was wondering just how you feel about today's event and the commemoration.
I think that was just beautiful, a wonderful thing. And I'm just proud of all of the folks here who put this together. And I'm glad that they allowed me to come to it.
Oh, well, it's our treat. You guys are all so nice. We enjoyed it, and I wish, like, I didn't get to know your dad, but everybody, as we were talking about this in town, and people remember him, and everybody has, I mean, he must have had a very powerful personality.
Yes, but not the overwhelming type. Not that at all. In fact, he could build up the confidence in somebody as well as anybody I can think of.
How was he during the Vietnam War, and you were there, you were in the war, and I know, and he was a target of a lot of anger, I know. How was that on the family?
Well, I think that it hurt him a lot, but this, I think, was typical of him. Roll with the punch and keep doing what you think you have to do. And have thick skin if you're going to have.
I was impressed. I know I read in the prologue of Flynn's book when your dad was, it was 1970, so he was fairly up in years.
Yes.
And he spoke to a crowd of students at UCLA, and that was a very courageous thing to do.
Yes. But he didn't back down from things like that. He didn't get nasty. In fact, he could kind of turn some of these things around and maybe make them feel funny the way he could turn them around.
Yeah. Did I was going to ask you something. When you were in Vietnam, okay, did you, and people knew who your father was, did you get
any static from it? Oh, no. No, I didn't, but as a regimental commander, and we were right up on the front line along the DMZ, who's going to give you a lot of static about something like that?
Right, other priorities. Yeah.
Yes, and during the job, what could they say? Oh, I can remember in World War II, a couple of kids. I heard this second or third hand. I just made a lieutenant and was platoon commander, and they said, one Hershey drafts me, now I have to go to the other one to fight. But he didn't say it to me, and it was said second or third hand in a laughing manner.
You got those guys coming and going,
the youngster, I think he was, I'm making out twice.
Those Hershey's, they're everywhere. Oh, now, but one final thing, if you would, tonight at the dinner, after we eat, we're going to ask some people if you'd share a special memory about your dad. Would you mind doing that?
All right. Well, let me think about it.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I'd mention it to you now, and you think about it, and then I'll just ask you, I won't put you on the spot, but if, I'll come up to you before the dinner, and if you think you'd like to,
all right,
we'll do it then.
I'll give it a go.
Yeah, okay. Something you want to share. Okay, is there anything that you would like to say, something about your dad or about...
Well, thinking for the record.
Yeah.
Well, there's just so many things to sort out. Some. He was a great father. It's as simple as that. But he had such a wonderful understanding of people. It's no wonder. I do wonder how he put up with me. I was a kid growing up, but not much of a student. But he always kept me around. He fed me or had me fed. Made sure that he didn't throw me out. And,
I can't imagine I bet you were nice to have around too.
Oh, I was a brat.
Were you?
Oh, sure.
Was that because? Well, did you guys move around a lot with your dad?
Oh yeah. Well, we moved. Of course, we moved on a very regular basis, if you will. But he wasn't on long deployments. There were places they had to go out maybe for 3 or 4 weeks and come back. But now in my own family, 6-month cruises. Our units had a regular 6-month cruise. Out of a 2-year stay, you had maybe 1 6-month cruise. When I say cruise, we kept Marine Marine landing forces aboard the Mediterranean fleet ships. And when I was at Camp Lejeune, we were continually turning over battalions out there. And then, of course, when I went off to war, now I wasn't married when went off to World War II, but I was married when both times I was in Korea and when I was in Vietnam.
Didn't you think you were pushing your luck to go to so many wars?
Well,
especially after Korea, you said that's where you were injured.
My feeling was that that's what I was being paid to do. And quite frankly, I was conceited enough to feel that I could take a group of men, whether we're talking about a platoon or a squad or a regiment, that I could take those men out, bring more of them back than the next guy, and get the job done.
Well, that's what you need. Well, thank you.
As I say, I was discontent, I suppose, when I wasn't able to, and that's why I worked my bolt to get back to Korea. I felt, look, that's our war. I'm supposed to be out there.
That was a definite And what happened to you? How were you injured there? Can I ask you that? Or
Yes, I got hit by 3 heavy mortar shells. I was on top of the hill. I was out in front of the lines. In fact, I took one of the squad leaders. I wanted to show him he was going to take out the patrol that night. I wanted to show him just where to take the patrol. And I had worked my way up to the top of this hill. He was about 10, 12 yards behind me. I was lying down because I was looking over the hill. And these 3 heavy mortar rounds came in on top of me. Apparently they hit just behind me because it mostly drove everything up here and here and all over. The boy that was with me was back about 10 yards in a little, what we call a spider hole. It was been dug out. But he was down in it. He had his arm torn off. That was his only injury, but he lost his arm. So,
no wonder you're able to walk or anything.
oh, well,
And your spine.
I'm too ornery not to.
See, it pays to be a brat sometimes.
I guess so.
Oh.
But this boy that lost his arm, he called. He said, they've got my arm. We had 2 other men that had accompanied us, but they were clear down at the bottom of the hill. And I couldn't move. I was just like I was pinned to the ground. But they came up and they wanted to know how I was. And I said, well, you get the sergeant out of here and get him back. See if we can't save that arm.
Boy, what a
And
presence of mind.
they said, what about you? And, well, when you get back, send somebody out with a stretcher.
God. They did it much better than I would have done. I'm afraid. Well, you were the right person for the job. Thank you. Oh, good. Do you ever hear from that young man? Do you keep in touch much with some
Well,
people?
not that much. Yes, in fact, when I was medevaced, taken back to the hospital ship, for the first year or so, I got old letters from half the company. I was company commander at the time. But I'm afraid I tried to answer them, but, you know, and it kind of fell off. So.
Yeah, it's hard to keep in touch. Well, listen, thank you. I don't want to keep you too long. You think about tonight, something,
All
if
right.
there's a special memory.
Something relating to my dad that
Yeah.
might be worth,
To share with.
something humorous.
Yeah, yeah.
All
That'd
right.
be nice. Oh, good.
Well, I'll give it a go.
Frederick is in the middle, and we have some friends around here that are Fredericks, so I just thought I'd bring that up. But I'm the second son, of course. Gil is the older boy, and I'm in the middle because my sister Kitty is the oldest, then Gil, then myself, and then Ellen Margaret.
Okay. And could you mentioned your middle name was Frederick, right? Could you kind of just tell us about your short engagement?
I was 7 years old, and some very good friends of my family, especially my dad, I guess, were out in California visiting, and we'd been in El Paso, Texas, because that's where my dad had been stationed. And we met them up in Hollywood. And Eileen Frederick, that was, of course, her maiden name. And I just had a little romance, I guess, because we walked around Hollywood, and I was looking for a ring. we said we were engaged, and I guess we were gone long enough that people got worried that I was lost, or maybe both of us. I don't know.
Kind of worldly for you.
Well, that...
I guess it was Hollywood, though.
I don't know. I can't tell you. I was only 7. I didn't realize that was my age, but I guess that's what it comes down to.
And now, had you seen her recently?
Never seen her since then.
Until today?
That's right.
Oh, wow.
But, of course, as soon as she said Eileen Frederick, of course, the fact that my middle name was Frederick, maybe because the family was such good friends. I'm not sure where I got the name, and I can't find out now. I don't know anybody that can help me there, but...
Well, that's a good explanation as any, really. Okay. Well, now, you were with the service, too. If you could kind of just give me a little background on your on yourself, on your military background.
I went to the Merchant Marine Academy in 1944, beginning of January of 1944, and when I graduated, they took or most of our class into the Navy, about 65%. So I was commissioned in the Navy, and I guess I went in 43 because I was commissioned in June of 1944. And then I went to the Pacific on a battleship.
How long were you in the Pacific?
From then through the end of the war, and another. Let's see. I got out of the Navy in October of 46, I guess.
Okay. Now, Gil said that he was surprised his dad put up with him as a child. So he said he was a real brat. Now, is that true?
Well, I think we're on tape. I shouldn't say that. You know, he broke my nose. He abused me a little bit. In fact, I think one of the things I remember, he said, George, if we sprung from apes, you didn't jump far enough. But he was always a joker.
Oh, well, I'll ask you another question I asked him. You got into the military. Now, do you think your dad influenced you at all to do that, or?
Well, the war influenced. You know, the boys couldn't wait to get in. We even went down to. They were living in Washington D.C. And I was, of course, living there. And I remember going down to the Canadian Embassy to see about joining. That's our CAF. And this is before we got into the war, because they said, well, when the U.S. gets into the war, you can transfer over. But you had to have parents' permission. Anyway, all the kids wanted to get in when they were old enough.
Very different in the 60s and 70s.
Well, it was a big war.
Yeah.
And it makes a difference when you get jumped on like Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, it does. What about, do you have any particular thoughts about what we're doing here today with this?
Well, I feel very privileged to have been able to come back and come to a country that, of course, I'm quite familiar with through my childhood and later, and the tribute that they're paying to my father is, I think it's just great.
We're very happy you're here.
I think it's good.
Would you mind, I don't know, later today at the dinner, we're thinking about, asking family members to share some memory about your dad. Would you be willing, or would you mind if I asked you at that point to share something?
I'll have to think of something that's appropriate, but I really do appreciate what Tri-State has done and how much it meant to him and to my mom, too, of course.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, she was from this area, too, and a lot of people. They were a real favorite. The editor for the Herald Republican here in town, she remembers that as a little girl, your dad coming into town on the limo, and it was always a big event, He came back. He was a favorite.
He always came back.
Yeah.
Right to the end.
That's right. And in fact, we have some pictures. Did you send them back that was taken of your dad the night before he died?
No, that's probably Gil, because Gil was with him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Gil and his wife came in a private plane out of Washington, because I was in Washington, and I went just back on leave or something, I forget. No, it's because my dad had a stroke. I'd gone back, and somebody that's connected with Tri-State had this jet aircraft that they, so Gil and his wife and dad came out for, I guess it was graduation, I'm not sure. And, but Dad passed away the day before.
Yeah, I bet it was graduation, so I think it was in May or something that he came out. Now, where are you from? Where do you live now?
I live in Washington State, Bremerton, Washington, which is near Seattle.
Your daughter is Kathleen Cadillac.
Yeah, no, that's Suzanne Cadillac.
Suzanne.
I have Kathleen Cartwright.
Yeah, okay.
And then I have a Barbara Jean Bond. Okay. So the 3 daughters and no sons. Three son-in-laws, but 7 grandchildren, so.
You're doing just fine.
Yeah.
Well, I talked to Suzanne on the phone. She's very nice.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
And
Okay, she's the
books.
Cadillac.
Is she here?
No, she wanted to come, and it just wasn't
I
really
know.
practical. Kids just started school. She has a young daughter, and she has a boy 15 and a daughter about 10 or 11. So,
Okay, yeah, but she was so nice to talk to on the phone. I talked to her a couple different times.
well, the reason she got into this, talking, her son was going to make a report, and so he decided to make it on my dad. And originally, the books that Tri-State carried, the paperback, we have the hardcover ones. And she couldn't find hers, so she got a hold of somebody here and asked how could she get a book, and they put us in touch with the author, and we ended up buying about 100 of them, but then distributing them between the... But that's how she happened to be calling to get a copy of that book for him to...
Oh, okay, well, you tell her. I said, hi, I'm sorry I didn't get to meet her.
Well, I know she was like...
Dr. Cyberling, the one that wrote that book. He's an interesting person, too.
Yes, I was hoping maybe he'd be here, but...
Yeah, I do, too. But I think he's going to. He also does a lot with cowboy.
He sent me a pamphlet of Tom Mix. It's his idol or whatever. But he said he was working on something, gathering everything he could on Tom Mix. And anyway, I wrote him because I'd gotten some pictures from him that they used in making that book, and I told him yes, I'd like those, and of course I wanted the other books too. And I told him I hoped I'd see him at the at this anniversary date, but
doesn't always work out. But I'm glad.
But he's from Hershey, Pennsylvania, at least at that time.
He said you were related to Milton Hershey.
Somewhere.
Well, way back a ways.
Yeah. We always said, he's probably 180th cousin, twice removed or whatever.
Something like that.
But the folks did stop there, and they had met him and got a tour, I guess. I've been through town, but I never got the tour.
Yeah, well, you got to take it. It's your namesake.
Well, it's kind of a long way from home, though.
No kidding. It's a long way from Washington.
Of course, this is nothing compared to my sister coming from Hawaii, but it's...
I need to get her in here, too.
Yeah.
Ellen, and then...
well, they have their son here who's at Fort Leavenworth.
Yeah.
And, of course, Gil got 2 of his children here. And Kitty got 3, so they all did pretty good.
Yeah, no kidding. It's a good reunion for you guys.
Yeah, that's the first time we've really gotten the whole group together for anything outside of a funeral or something, you know.
This is better.
So this is
better.
This works out great.
Oh, good. But I don't want to keep you from them any longer.
Okay, well, you'll probably have to tear up this microfilm.
No, I think we might start out with this. If you would just want to go ahead now and introduce yourself, give your name and how you're related, and introduce the man next to you.
But say something first and then introduce him.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Okay, and the only, you know what I was thinking, what about that bracelet for that banging, that might bang on the...
No, okay, I'll put
just
my
keep it
hand
down.
here.
Okay.
Yes, I'm Ellen Margaret Hershey Barth. I'm the youngest child also of the Hersheys, number 4 child. And I'd like to mention my dad was very sentimental. He used to give my mother a rose for every year they were married. So he got up to 59 roses. That was pretty good. And also I'd like to mention this pendant I have on. It says on here, it says 1907, 10 September, and then 1969. And my mother and dad met that day, the first day of the 7th grade. And he never forgot it. So this was 62 years later, he gave Mother this pendant. I thought that's awfully sweet. And also this little bracelet I have has XXX, 30 years of marriage, and has her initials on the other side. So anyhow, that's the other side of Dad. And he was a very rounded person, and he used to say to me, "You're just as good as everybody else, but not one bit better." I thought that was pretty good advice. And Mother used to say of him, from the Kipling quote, "He could walk with kings nor lose the common touch." And I think that was very, very true of him. Now, I'd like you to introduce my husband. This is Colonel Sam Barth, who's carted me around the world for 30 years in the Army, and now we live in Hawaii.
Yes, when I first met General Hershey, I was a sergeant in the Army. And this lady dragged me out to the home to get acquainted. And I was impressed because I'd never been in a general's home before, but it didn't seem to make any difference. And the fact that I was a Hoosier boy, the same as he was, I think helped me get along with the family. General Hershey was usually never at a loss for words. But the day I told him that we wanted to get married, I thought that he didn't have anything to say for a longer period than I usually remember. So it's a great experience to be here today and share these things.
Yes, it really has been.
Thank you. Boy, I can't even think of anything else to ask you now other than that, if there's any particular thing from, like when you were living at home with your dad, any special memory you can share now or even tonight at the dinner. When,
If I could recall.
And if you could tell them, the people at the dinner too, about your dad and the roses to your mom. That's beautiful. I think that's
Well.
Did anybody mention about him ironing?
No, the ironing. Oh, yes.
He did the laundry at home always, didn't he?
Yeah, because mother was sick off and on, and Dad was very helpful with everything. And I can well remember in high school when he was the busiest with the selective service during the war, and he would be down in the kitchen. I'd come down for a glass of milk or something from study, and he'd be in there ironing the ironing because he didn't want Mother to do it. And that's the way he was all his life with her. And he spoiled her, really.
Oh, that's very unusual. I mean, really.
Yeah, well, he sure did.
You said that he was well-rounded. When I was going through our archives, and there's trustees, the minutes from the trustees meetings are here from 1884.
Oh, I bet.
And when your dad was here in 1911 or 1912, he made a special request, and they just noted it, that they have okayed for Louis Hershey to take Virgil, an extra course in Virgil. And, if you want to take extra hours, it had to be approved. So he really loves the classics to read, evidently.
He was interested in everything.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very interested in psychology. And I think that's one thing that helped him a lot with his job. He was always reading the latest books on psychology. And this was early enough that, psychology wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And I think that's why he understood people so well. He just really figured them out.
I'm almost surprised he didn't have a political career.
He was a politician, all right, but
yeah,
in his own way, he was.
Well, but I think he was a soldier first. It's just he knew how to if he's going to make his system work, that it had to work through the political system. Of course, I think a lot of good soldiers at senior levels in Washington take the same approach.
Mm-hmm.
The President Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is a good example.
Yeah.
The new one, you mean the?
Well, you're talking about Colin Powell.
Yeah, Colin Powell.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But he, I was just talking to a lady that worked in selective service, and she was saying it was just marvelous the way he could take a bunch of officers there at headquarters that were arguing about something, back and forth. He'd walk in there, and he'd settle them all down and smooth them out, and they'd come to a decision of some kind, which they had to do. She said it was amazing how he could do that. But that because he understood people, I think. Mm-hmm. He knew how to work it.
And yet he had some presence. I know I mentioned to George, I think, when I've been talking to people about this event, and even people that just barely know him or were really young when he would come to town, he'd come back and they said, boy, when General Hershey came in the limo, it was a big day, and everybody went out to see him, but he made such an impact. He had such presence.
Well, he did that in his speech making. He was very, very popular for speech. He had speeches lined up a year or two ahead, because he'd say, well, let's see, January 2 years from now, I'm going to be busy. He kind of joked about it. But he was so good with speeches. And I remember friends of ours who'd gone like American Legion Convention or something, they said he'd get a standing ovation every time he spoke, because he was clever, he was witty, and he was interesting.
What he said, that he had the same speech that sometimes he'd begin at the beginning and go straight through, and sometimes he'd begin at the end and go backwards through it.
Yeah, and sometimes he said he went in the middle and went both ways. And he came to visit us once, and you were a young lieutenant, learning to make speeches and things, and he whipped his 3-by-5 card out, and here's my speech I'm going to give in Denver. And, we couldn't believe it. He said, oh, yeah, that's all I needed. But he really enjoyed speaking.
The 3-by-5 cards remind me of how he used to carry them around to make notes on, and taught me. And here I am still carrying 3-by-5 cards around to make notes on.
But he loved to speak, and he liked to talk.
Was your mother comfortable in the public light at all?
Yeah, she was, but she was a more quiet person, and she wasn't a big joiner or anything, clubs and all, but she was very supportive of everything he did, and she was very happy that he was in the Army. She really enjoyed the Army.
I was interested. I read just a little bit of Flynn's book that she went off to the Philippines.
Right.
For a little adventure.
In 1913, because she was just a young girl, and she went out with her great uncle, who was at that time the deputy governor, and he had a daughter that she went out to be a companion to, and then she taught school in an Episcopal school in the Philippines for that year. She was like 20 years old, and she'd never been anywhere. I mean, I don't think she'd been out of Indiana.
No,
and of course,
that book anyway.
Of course, she thought that living over there was great. Of course, those days, it was a house full of servants and things. That it was the oldie days. She thought this is pretty good living, and no, but she enjoyed it. In fact, Dad got worried because she was running around with one of the governor's aides, and he thought maybe she wasn't coming back.
Yeah.
But she did. He waited for her. She said he sure had to wait a long time. He didn't get around to.
Did she go into nursing too?
Yes, she did. In fact, she was in nursing when they got married. Okay. She had gone up to Chicago for nursing. Now, this was after the Philippines.
Yeah.
And they were engaged, and then they thought he was going overseas right away. So they got married, and she went back to nursing, but it was unofficial because she wasn't. Those days, you couldn't be married and taking nursing. Right. But then she had trouble with her feet and couldn't stand on her feet long.
They got married down at Camp Shelby, didn't they?
Well, yes, at Jackson, Mississippi, which is close to Camp Shelby. And then she went back to nursing.
Okay.
But then she had trouble with her feet, so she got out of nursing and went back to Angola, and then they announced their marriage because then it was, of course, all right. Then he went overseas after that.
Mm-hmm. And that was World War I.
Yeah, he went over about 1918.
Yeah.
The war was almost over. So she went to work in Washington, D.C. She worked in one of the government agencies there while he was overseas. So that, kind of gave her a flavor, too. And I think she really wanted him to stay in the Army. She encouraged him to, and I think that made a lot of difference to him because of her opinion, sure.
Right.
So,
well, they sure did a good
Didn't they drive around the country visiting the Selective Service headquarters because your mother didn't like to fly? And
well, she liked driving in the car. Right. Well, she flew when she had to. But, of course, they were always traveling because they checked on all these draft boards all over the country, every headquarters in every state, the state headquarters, constantly.
Well, now, were you still at home then?
I was still home part of that time, and I graduated from high school in 44 and went away to college, but I was back a lot, and then I was married and went to
how did you
college.
meet?
Yeah, we were married while we were in college.
How'd we meet?
Yeah.
Well, my unit that I was in during World War II came back from Europe after the war was over. We were going to go to the Pacific. Fortunately, the Japanese surrendered, so we didn't have to go. And I was waiting to be discharged. And another sergeant in my outfit and I were sharing a room at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is outside of Washington. And he was dating a friend of Ellen's, and he invited me into a party.
A blind date?
No, she had a date.
Oh, yeah, I had a date. Just goes to show
she had a date.
These Hoosier boys, they have their attraction. And we were married about a year later.
So you saw her at the party and
I saw her at the party and we dated
through mutual friends. And then we started dating.
We shared the Indiana commonality.
Oh, sure. But anyway, so we were married a year later, and then I transferred from the University of Maryland to Indiana University because he was already re-enrolled because he had been there before the war.
Well, that's what upset our parents because we were still in college when we got married. And
well, it wasn't done then as much. This
well,
was the
it was
first
done,
bunch.
but the
First
veterans,
bunch.
which I was. So.
Yeah. Well, what did you study in school?
History. The history major.
Now, did you do anything? Did you teach
No, I didn't. No, because
She taught 4 children.
Yeah, so just doing anything is not the right way to say it.
No, because when Sam graduated, we went right in the Army. That's what he wanted. He got a regular commission. And so then we started on our Army career, and we were sent to Germany about a year later. So
how'd
it was,
you like that?
oh, we loved it. We had 2 tours over there, 6 years total.
I have one of my girlfriends teaches like at an Army base.
Yeah, yeah.
She's not coming back.
Really? Where is she in Germany? Do you know?
I should know. No, I don't know the name of the place.
But it's fascinating. And of course, we were there right after the war, which was one situation.
First time, yeah,
The first
49.
time. Then we went back 9 years later, and it was a whole different country.
Mm-hmm.
It was just wonderful to see, what the Germans had done. And we went back to visit last year, and that was fun to go back and swap houses with the German families. So.
The Hershey's came to visit us both times we were over there, though. 51, and again in...
Our first child was born over there, so they had to come and check in on the grandchild, of course, yeah.
Oh, what a great grandparent.
Yeah, oh, they were all...
Any place
you went, they were there.
interested in their family.
And as soon as we would get one place, they would come, whenever it was convenient, but right away if they could.
Oh, that's
They really, they did that with my brother when he was in the Marines, too. And, Dad used to write us kids every Sunday. He always wrote us every Sunday. If we were away and the 3 of us were gone, every Sunday he wrote us. And if he was extremely busy, he'd dictate it. But lots of the time he wrote it in longhand. I have all those letters. And it's just, just bits of philosophy.
Oh, I wish I could have
And birthday letters. He sent all of us. He had 13 grandchildren and 4 of us kids and our spouses. So he wrote birthday letters to the 8 children and the 13 grandchildren every year. The wonderful letter about how great you are.
What a guy. Oh, wonderful.
He was.
Well, thank you very, very
Oh,
much.
you're welcome.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Did you run out of film?
We're not having...
All right, if you just go ahead, if you please introduce yourself and tell me where you work.
My name is Scott Kohlhaas. I'm the chairman of Area Office 6, Local Board 28 in Indianapolis, and I work for Stone Container Corporation out of Indianapolis.
Okay, and what's your relationship to the Selective Service?
I've been on a draft board, a local board, for about 2 years now.
Okay, could you just give us an idea, because I know I don't have any idea what that means, or what do you do as a member of the draft board?
Actually, it's the easiest community service I've ever done. I'd like to get more involved, but it's just 1 weekend a year, continuation training, keeping us primed and up to date on all recent directives and laws and regulations concerning selective service, so that in the event of a draft, we're in place and ready to do our job.
Now, were you familiar with General Hershey prior to this? Could you just tell me about...
Yes. As a matter of fact, I'm really lucky to be here. I was reading Mr. Flynn's book on General Hershey, and I noticed that his birthday was September 19th, and 1893. So I knew...
12th.
Well, actually, his birthday is the 19th.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is...
Okay.
But anyway, and so I was wondering if there was going to be a commemoration. So I called my regional headquarters and asked, and they weren't sure. They thought there would be, but they checked, and they got back to me and said there was, and that I was invited. So, I feel kind of privileged and lucky to be here.
Oh, good. So you were just reading the book on your own?
Right.
Have you had a chance to speak with George Flynn?
Yes, I have, and I thanked him because I told him, it's his responsibility for me being here, technically. So, I was pleased to meet him, and I met the Director of Selective Service, Robert Gambino, and I got my picture taken with him, so that was a thrill. And so I'll just go back to my board and just brag a little,
Well, what do you think? Just tell me about what you think of today's events here at Tri-State.
I'm impressed. It's a family reunion. I feel like I belong in one way because I'm continuing what he started, and yet it's kind of fun to just be an observer from the outside too, and just see the family members, and the family resemblance is incredible, and a lot of second cousins, fourth cousins, and it's just really nice to meet them, and I know they support what we're doing. So it's a good time.
And what's your opinion, about my last question, of the General's impact on the Selective Service?
General Hershey?
Right.
Well, he was Selective Service, and what more can I say? His influence was tremendous, and I was reading about him because I am fascinated with the whole issue of manpower mobilization, and of course with my involvement in Selective Service, he's like, I wouldn't say an idol, but he's someone that I could definitely learn from and have, and it's interesting. It's good to have a historical perspective, as we go on into the future and know what went on in the past. So my impression of General Hershey is a strong impression. I'm happy to be part of what he built.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, that'll do, I think.
The Indiana State Representative for District 51, which covers all of Steuben County and also part of DeKalb County and a little bit of LaGrange County. And I've lived in this area all of my life, and I've known of General Hershey since I was a little boy, and looked up to him as one of our local heroes, and I think he still has that image in my mind today. I think the Tri-State University has done a great thing in having this special commemoration of his 100th birthday, and I was glad to be invited and to be here today because I think he was a great American, and I'm involved in politics, and I think he was a great politician even though he never ran for an elective office and didn't campaign for that type of office, but I still think he really got along with people well. He knew how to deal with people and how to negotiate things, and I think we can be very proud here in this part of Indiana that he was born and raised here and came back here and spent a lot of time here even in his later years, and we appreciate him very much and are very thankful for his service to the United States of America and to Indiana and to Tri-State University and the Angola community here. I think the university has a great legacy that he was a member of their Board of Trustees, and he also was a graduate here. I think that's probably going to be one of the greatest things that Tri-State University has for years and years and years to come. We are involved in a lot of things here in the community, and I think it's good to be able to have someone who's kind of a famous person to be able to identify with the local community here, and I think it's been a great advantage for us to be able to say this is where General Hershey was from. And I just appreciate being able to be here today and being a part of this great celebration.
Excellent. To the camera.
Okay. Well, my name, you just want to get my name. Jim Zimmerman, professor of history at Tri-State University. I guess my first involvement with Hershey's connection to Tri-State was as a professor in 1973 taken to Best Hall by a colleague and shown the massive amount of Hershey papers and memorabilia that had been presented to us by General Hershey. And I was told at the time that I might be invited with others to somehow adapt that material to an archival facility. He already had the museum facility here at the university. Well, that didn't happen. The next thing I heard some years later was that the material went on to the Carlisle Barracks. I think what's important about today is that the university commemorate someone who made the contribution that General Hershey did in the service of his country. That connection, that role, the importance of that was certainly very much highlighted by Professor Flynn today. I think for us, it's sort of a wake-up call to recognize what it is that we have on this campus in the way of a resource that we need to be about the business of better utilizing. And so, from that standpoint, I'm interested from that standpoint of we here on the campus, signaling ourselves to be better attentive to the Hershey material.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there, let me say something.
Actually, I've been so busy with the the minutia of things that are related to an event of this kind that I didn't have much of an opportunity for reception to circulate. That's what I'm trying to say. I did after the meeting. I've had an opportunity to meet with two of the children, but only very briefly. So I'm looking forward to this evening. I find these people, the ones that I've met, to be a reflection of the general, at least as he's described. My own personal recollections of General Hershey are minimal as a young faculty person here. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I have some recollection of meeting him in the reception line or something along those lines, but never really any direct encounters.
That's funny. I mean, that's exactly what I think from meeting Gilbert and George and Ellen. And they're very warm, they're good storytellers. You know,
yes.
Just the kind of adjectives you hear for their dad, I think have been passed down to them. They're good people.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's probably, unless there's anything you want to tack on or add.
No, I don't think so. I think it's important for him to get on down to
yeah, let's go.
To Hershey.
Okay. Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
Well, all four of us.
No, I know. No, I told and then one of us would say, oh, is this her? Yeah, but she ran the... That was a long time. She was.
They say evacuation. A lot of people say, oh, I want to stay and watch. Frank Barth. I'm the grandson of Louis B. Hershey. I'm in the Navy United States Army. I'm stationed in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, the same school that my grandfather went to 60 years ago, where my father went to 30 years ago. We really enjoyed the events of the day, being able to see all friends and family, and also to see the impact that Louis Hershey had on so many people and his contributions to this country. I know him as a grandfather who would go ride on my bike together, a person that could treat a 6-year-old just like if he was head of state, and a person I am very proud of. This is my wife, Beth, my son, Colin, my son, Brandon. You guys have anything you want to say?
No. We unfortunately did not have the opportunity to know General Hershey when he was alive, but we've been trying to learn his history through Frank, as well as through all the events of the day. So we're coming from Kansas to introduce our children to their great-grandfather and learning about Frank's grandfather.
You guys want to say anything?
No. Well, why don't you tell us how old you are?
How old
9. 6. We're glad you came.
Well, we won't hold that against them. One thing that's interesting is Louis Hershey's had a great involvement in scouting, and we're kind of carrying on that tradition. Colin's a Tiger Cub. Brandon is in his 3rd year. He's a Bear Scout, Cub Scout, and I'm a den leader, and Beth's a coordinator for Tiger Cubs.
So I'm a Tiger woman.
Tiger woman.
Thank you.
I've only been there. Oh, really? I went to Vancouver. She was here. She was out here.
System, and
Him, okay. Hello, I'm here with Director Robert Gambito with the Selective Service System, and he was kind enough to join us today for the commemoration of General Lewis Blaine Hershey's 100th birthday. Thank you for being here.
I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in the celebration of General Hershey's 100th birthday. As you know, he's quite a outstanding individual in every respect, not only head of the Selective Service for 29 years, but for his other civic activities, including the Boy Scouts and just ever endeavor he's touched, he was a success in. Family man, career military officer, and certainly as a director of the Selective Service. It's kind of humbling to have been selected by the President to follow in his footsteps, and I don't have the challenges that he had, but my interest in the Selective Service and in the Selective Service family that he founded is very intense. And thank you very much for inviting me here.
Well, thank you for coming.
Continuation of the celebration of General Hershey's 100th birthday. The salads will be put on the table in just a minute or two here, and the buffet will be open after the invocation. And I think, so that we don't have 95 people rush to the buffet at the same time, we'll start with our young tour guides, here's the correct word, who volunteered to help with today's program, and we'll go right down this way, and yes, Dorothy Perchan, right this way and right around the room. All right, folks? And it'll be a two-line buffet, so gather on both sides of the table. And at this time, I would like to have Dr. Radcliffe come up and offer a blessing. Dr. Radcliffe?
Right here. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we come to the close of this day, thanking you for the blessings, thanking you for the one whose 100th birthday we have celebrated, and for the tremendous contribution that he made to mankind. Other places done locally. And we do not forget to thank you for the food that we're going to eat. We ask that you would bless that in our use, bless us for your service, and give us the strength we need to do your will in all things. Thank you for it in the name of him who said, I am the way and the truth and the life.
Drinks will also be brought to the table, iced tea and lemonade, and whatever you request we'll serve at the table. And then following dinner, we'll commence with the program. And anyone that has anything they'd like to say in the way of a memory about General Hershey, we'll ask you to do that after our speakers this evening. We'll go table by table, and I hope everyone will have a little something to add to the program. So enjoy the meal, and following the meal, we'll get the program going then. begin the program. It's my pleasure to introduce our chairman of the board, Dr. William Gettig. Dr. Gettig is a tri-state graduate, class of 1949, mechanical engineer. He served in the Navy in World War II and has been a very, very special person to Tri-State University over the years. So at this time, I would ask Dr. Gettig to come forward and offer a welcome. Bill?
Thank you, Butch. Welcome to everyone on behalf of the board and the university. Thank you very much for coming. I won't be redundant and talk to you about history or enlistments or when we volunteered or didn't, because our historian's done such a great job. But I will say that on this occasion, I'm very grateful to Tri-State, as I'm sure General Hershey was, for what he received here. And as I said earlier today, he's probably the most illustrious alum that he is the most illustrious and well-known alum that we've ever had. Hopefully we could have someone just as important in the future that cared as much about Tri-State as General Hershey did. In any case, on behalf of the board and the university, thank you so much. Thank all of you, too, who had anything to do with the presentations today, which I'm sure everyone's enjoyed. And I want to say to Gilbert and to George Hershey, I found that he and I served on the same battleship in World War II, although we weren't acquainted. And so it's a rather small world. Anyhow, thank you all very much. And I hope that, I'm sorry that we couldn't all be here for the 200th anniversary, but I'll be looking for you.
Our first speaker tonight is Mr. Robert Spinogle. Mr. Spinogle was appointed National Adjutant of the American Legion in July of 1981. Prior to that, he had served as Executive Director of the American Legion's Washington, D.C. headquarters and as the Director of Internal Affairs for the American Legion. Bob also served in the Vietnam War. Following his Army career, he attended Lansing Community College and Michigan State University, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Mathematics. While at Michigan State University, Bob served as President of the National Association of Collegiate Veterans, a well-known veterans fraternity. He's a member of the USO World Board of Governors. He serves on the Board of Directors of the Indianapolis Athletic Club and on the Board of Directors for St. Mary of the Woods College. In 1979, he was named one of the outstanding Vietnam War veterans from the state of Indiana by then Governor Otis Bowen. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Robert Spinogle.
I want to thank Butch for that very kind introduction. Chairman Getty, it's my honor to be here. And if you find out something in mechanical engineering that will get me here on General Hershey's 200th birthday, that'd be a great engineering feat, one I look forward to being part of. Certainly to the Director of Selective Service Gambino, to distinguished guests, the Hershey family, and friends. You know, I come here probably as one who met General Hershey exactly twice. I met him in 1960 by mail through my local draft board, who so kindly gave me that little card that we all carried there in the late 50s and early 60s. But you know, in some of the remarks this morning, I kind of remembered that with the remarks there at the service this morning, because that was part of growing up in America. That was part of being part of a small community, as was mentioned earlier this morning by the professor. Even in the larger cities in the late 50s and the early 60s, all they were basically in the large cities were small cities put together in a large metropolis. You know, I have 2 sons now that are in the National Guard and ROTC, and they find it awfully strange. They think I'm as old as Methuselah when I try to describe that period of time, because they have grown up in a completely different world. But perhaps as I kind of thought about addressing this distinguished group, I kind of thought about General Hershey and his representation of that portion of my life and many young men's lives at that time. And as one of his biographers wrote, he was a lumbering, powerful son of the soil with a refreshing, homespun philosophy of life, a student of man, his rights, his obligation to his country. And as the general said about his boyhood in Steuben County, and very similar to a lot of those in this room, first, we all believed in work, hard work and long hours. Second, we learned late and early in life how important it is to rely on a person's word. And look at the general's career. He lived certainly by those 2 rules. A student, a teacher, an administrator, a citizen soldier, who later became a member of the regular army, and of course, as history, and many of us know him, Mr. Selective Service. In later years, he became a community leader, a philanthropist, and a humanitarian. This audience certainly contains many who knew General Hershey better than I. But in preparation, I reflected back to the second time I met General Hershey. And unlike 1960, I met him personally, and it was at an American Legion convention in Portland, Oregon. And as Butch had said earlier by my introduction, I had been on the college campuses in the late 60s, after 3 years in the United States Army in the mid-1960s, and was a student at Michigan State, where I did head a collegiate student veterans group. So I was there during the campus protests, during the time that students were trying to burn down the ROTC building, and I can tell you one thing about Michigan State University. They did not burn down the ROTC building at Michigan State University thanks to the campus veterans who were there, because the ROTC building was connected with Jennison Fieldhouse, and we were all interested in athletics. But seriously, in a serious note, we guarded it just about every night so we could watch basketball. But anyway, I don't mean to talk about the 60s very long, but certainly all the anti-war demonstrations, the anti-draft demonstrations. And in a sense, it kind of reminds me, if you look back on that period of history of our time, or at least as I even looked at it then, it was kind of like the English version of the world turned upside down. Well, when I met General Hershey, I was intrigued a little bit by having the opportunity to meet him. And of course, just before that time I met him in 1970, at the University of Michigan there was a very big anti-war, anti-draft demonstration. And as you recall, they'd stand on the Commons, or they'd stand in front of the administration building, they'd hold up a mail bag, or some sort of bag, and they'd burn their draft cards and they'd put them in there. And then somebody else would come along and put their draft cards. So I asked and of course they always mailed them to General Hershey. So I asked General Hershey what he felt like when he got all of those draft cards. What was his attitude about this generation of Americans? And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Spinogle, with a little smile on his face, and he said, out of that big bag I will find about 5 or 6 draft cards. He said the rest of them will be various papers of some other assorted things, like that little ID thing in your wallet that you never fill out with name and address and all of that sort of thing. That's what went in the mailbag. But I think really what General Hershey knew, even at that moment of our history, and a history that I lived and many of you lived, he knew that basically America was still patriotic in the small towns. As Professor Flynn said this morning, and I kind of reflected on that, his patriotism, his sense of duty. And recently I read a book called Stewardship by Peter Block, who wrote The Empowering Manager. And he has that book subtitled Choosing Service Over Self-Interest. And it's a modern book. It's a management book that people today read. And there's a quote about stewardship that Peter Block quotes from. It says, stewardship begins with the willingness to be accountable for some larger body than ourselves, an organization, a community. Stewardship springs from a set of beliefs about reforming organizations that affirms our choice for service over the pursuit of self-interest. When we choose service over self-interest, we say we are willing to be deeply accountable without choosing to control the world around us, and it usually requires a level of trust that we're not used to holding. And if that doesn't reflect back, in my mind, on what General Hershey believed, the beliefs that he learned here in Steuben County, they're the same lessons he learned from his family, his neighbors, and through his own intellect and his own hard pursuit of knowledge, hard work, and trust in your fellow man. As George Flynn put it, he came out with the beliefs of small-town America. I had the opportunity today to, I always look around cities when I come to a city, and just kind of drove Angola east to west, north to south. And they still have movie theaters downtown. And that just amazes me for this community, and those of you who live in it must treasure this community beyond words. But this is not unlike other communities throughout this country. And Professor Flynn, if I could just read just a portion with your permission from one of your papers. Hershey succeeded in his leadership role because he reflected and supported several enduring myths. The system was built upon the myth of a rural America of small towns where everyone knew everyone else and where defense was the responsibility of the citizen soldier. Hershey believed in the patriotic community where loyalty was a paramount virtue and where the most honored citizen was the veteran. He was committed to an egalitarian community where class and racial tensions did not exist and everyone worked for the general good. This philosophy stirred strong feelings of support among his family, whose members responded with enthusiasm to his leadership. Hershey did not need statutory authority to influence the system. As one staff officer wrote, "For 25 years I have tried to do successfully a job in which the impetus and the inspiration came 80% directly from you as an individual. I have found myself unconsciously sounding like you, telling your stories because of your personality, influenced mine so greatly over the years. Time and time again, his state director spoke of the genuine affection we hold for you, our greatest chief. Local boards tried to do what he wanted without being asked. No godfather could have asked for more." In summary, we of the American Legion honored him in 1946, immediately after World War II, with our highest award, the Distinguished Service Medal. And General Hershey honored us with his membership, his counsel, his friendship, and his service. And I'd like to call, if I could, Butch, just briefly, a great associate of General Hershey's, to join me at the podium to talk about Anavicus, which is the Army, Navy, Air Force in Canada, United States unit. Elizabeth, Denny, come on up here.
Yes, sir.
Because she is a longtime member, a great associate of General Hershey, and he was president of this association for many, many years.
20 to be exact.
20?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Father. I felt impelled to wear one of my many hats tonight when last week at the breakfast for Anavicus, which is always enjoyed by the Canadian veterans, Anavicus is an acronym. It stands for Army, Navy, and Air Force Veterans in Canada, United States Unit. And General Hershey was president of the United States Unit for close to 20 years. As many people know, he passed away in 1977, and in 1978, whenever the group meets in Washington, which is always in the wintertime and always in February, the Canadians and the American members of the unit go to the Arlington Cemetery and have a wreath-laying ceremony at General Hershey's grave. I have pictures of the one that we did this year. It had snowed on Saturday night, but the Arlington Cemetery had their snow shovelers out there bright and early Monday morning, so that we didn't have to stand in the snow. The Military District of Washington furnishes the bugler and the wreath bearer, and we furnish the people who come to honor the General's memory in Arlington Cemetery at his grave. One of the things that has haunted me a good bit of my career is the fact that you don't draft women. How come you're a member of selective service? And I'll just give my personal little insight. In 1950, Colonel Ulmer, who was then the General Counsel, telephoned me I had worked for Colonel Ulmer in the Social Security Board. Ulmer was at Selective Service and said that he would like me to join the Selective Service Reserve. And I said, Colonel Ulmer, don't tell me we're going to war again so soon. Of course, I wasn't paying enough attention, see. If I'd have known Korea was hanging right around the corner. No, but he said, someday we might have to draft women, and we would like to have a woman among our professional staff so that we don't make any miscues. In case your arithmetic's about like mine, that was 43 years ago. They have yet to draft the first women, and as I understand it, the military services are wondering what to do with all the women they constantly get. But at least I was there to represent the women. Today, I would like to have all of you see the people in this room who are members of the Anavikas, which is the United States unit of this group that General Hershey was president of. Would you please stand? On behalf of these members and of Judge Foley, who regretted very much that his commitments would not permit him to be here with us tonight, I bring you greetings from the Army, Navy, and Air Force veterans in Canada and the United States unit. Thank you very much.
Mr. Spinogle, Commander Denny, thank you very much for those comments and remarks. Our second speaker is Mr. Robert W. Gambino. Mr. Gambino was appointed the Director of the Selective Service System in March of 1991 by President George Bush. He has served in the Central Intelligence Agency for over 20 years. He has served in the Army in both an active and reserve role for 29 years, retired from the Army in 1986 with the rank of Colonel. Bob was born in Martinsburg, West Virginia. He earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia, a law degree, and a master's degree from the George Washington University. He's a member of the Virginia Bar Association. He serves on the board of directors of the Krasnow Institute for Advanced Studies at George Mason University. He has been an excellent supporter of the historical effort by the Selective Service and by Tri-State University, and we consider him an excellent friend of this university. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Robert Gambino.
Thank you, Butch. Thank you again, Mr. Butch, Mr. Chairman Getting, distinguished guests, members of the Hershey family, ladies and gentlemen. I regret to tell you that I never met General Hershey personally. I wish I had. I think I could have learned a lot from him. But I do feel I know him. I know him very well through his writings and records and artifacts, but mostly through his friends, like Commander Denning and others who actually worked with General Hershey over many years. And in addition to the thousands of Selective Service members of the Selective Service family that today exists in every state of the Union, who join together from time to time, even though they're not now associated with the Selective Service, to honor the memory of General Hershey and attempt to live by the virtues that he espoused so well during the many years he was associated with the organization. Visiting Tri-State, again, is a personal delight for me, and this visit for a historical occasion is especially meaningful. It's an honor to participate in the 100th birthday celebration of my most distinguished predecessor. As George Flynn noted earlier, we are celebrating the deeds and remembering the life of Mr. Selective Service, and that means an awful lot to me. To say that General Hershey left his enduring mark on the agency he loved and to which he devoted his life's work would be a gross understatement. For 29 years as its director from 1991 to 1970, he was the Selective Service. Since he held that job, there have been many, well, not many, but just a handful of others like me who succeeded him.
but never would we dare to attempt to fill his shoes. Today, I sit behind the same big desk he used, and I take my place at the head of the same conference table at staff meetings. There are brass plates bearing his name on both pieces, and those brass plates are there to ensure that I never forget that it's his furniture I'm borrowing. Without parallel, he will always be remembered as the most revered in an agency he led for so long. And so while the spirit of my involvement with the Selective Service is the same, I know that my contributions pale in comparison to his. There will never be another director like Louis B. Hershey. With hundreds of thousands of other Americans, he shared both the glory and the heartache of war and peace over 3 decades. But it was he alone that led an agency with an often unpopular but critical, necessary mission. Through 3 major conflicts and periods of unprecedented global tension, he was a personification of American strength and commitment. We are now approaching the end of the century, and the world of the 1990s is vastly different from the world of General Hershey's time. We have not drafted anyone in over 20 years. Our biggest and strongest military adversary is gone. The all-voluntary force proved its worth in limited regional conflicts, Grenada, Panama, and the Persian Gulf. Yet, I believe there's some truth in the old saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. The timeless perils of human conflict are still out there. We are witnessing with concern the spread of nuclear capability to the Third World. We see ethnic strike and killing unabated in Europe. We still face the dangers of communism in Asia. And while peace seems closer between Israel and its neighbors, we must remain wary of continuing tensions throughout the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. Like other nations, we must also deal with nagging economic problems. Our nation's responses to today's challenges are still being defined. We are witnessing substantial reductions in both sides of active and reserve forces and withdrawing our forces from overseas, while at the same time we're having difficulty recruiting replacements. In addition, many of our senior military leaders are expressing concern about military readiness. As most of you know, I'm sure, the Department of Defense has just completed its long-awaited bottoms-up review, which we hope and expect will provide us a blueprint for the nation's military needs for today and the future. We all recognize that defense costs must be in consonance with economic realities. We hope this review and congressional response will recognize the need to maintain both a strong and state-of-the-art active force supported by modernized reserve forces and a standby capability to mobilize the nation's manpower in the event of a national crisis. This formula has served the nation well over the years, and while we recognize that new problems will require innovation and different approaches to solve, experience and history help us avoid repeating mistakes. However, today, alarmingly, we find ourselves in the middle of a congressional action which may eliminate the Selective Service system. It is often said that past is prologue, and that we must learn to suffer again by repeating what we have already experienced. And so it is that many of our citizens are very concerned about the ongoing debate about the future of the organization that General Hershey built and nurtured. What has become of the agency that has so successfully and cost-effectively served this republic for over 50 years? The issue is whether the Selective Service shall continue to be the nation's chosen instrument for augmenting the armed forces in time of unforeseen national crisis. Or should we deny ourselves this insurance in return for a savings of less than $30 million? I think General Hershey would be deeply concerned that there are many who believe the Selective Service has outlived its usefulness. They point to the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the volunteer military swift victory in the Persian Gulf. They apparently ignore the bitter lessons about unpreparedness that history has taught us time and time again. I believe these people could all benefit from a visit to Tri-State's Hershey Museum. Here they could learn a great deal about the wisdom of being prepared in an often hostile world. President Clinton has noted on several occasions that the world is still a dangerous and uncertain place. His fiscal 94 budget request for the Selective Service System would fully fund the agency and retain the nation's capability to reconstitute rapidly the armed forces if needed in an emergency. The system, the Selective Service System today, can promptly fill the ranks on a fair and equitable basis. And I emphasize fair and equitable. A time may come again when the national interest requires that some, but not all, young Americans be selected to serve in the armed forces. How will these selections be made? The American people will accept nothing less than a process that guarantees selection for involuntary military service be absolutely fair. The Selective Service System guarantees such a process. It has been honed, practiced, and tested for many years, and deserves the confidence of our citizens. With peacetime registration, over 97% of all men obligated to register are in fact registered. The high compliance with the law, coupled with a scientifically designed and tested random lottery drawing system, assures that every registrant of prime draft age has the same mathematical chance of being selected in any crisis requiring a return to the draft. And I think that's very important. You may be aware that the House of Representatives voted in June to cut President Clinton's budget request to only $5 million, with the intention of terminating the agency by the 31st of December this year. Much has appeared in the news media about this issue, and you'll probably see much more coverage in the weeks ahead. Everyone associated with the Selective Service, many members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, the agencies involved in national security, educators, senior military officers, and citizens have expressed strong objections to the House action. Last week, fortunately, preliminary action in the Senate provided some hope for relief. The Senate Appropriations Committee completed its markup of President Clinton's 1994 spending bill covering the Selective Service, which provides us with $25 million for Selective Service in 1994. This amount rejects a House vote to close the agency down, but it trims our budget $4 million below the President's request. It's a 14% cut, and that's painful, but it's certainly better than putting the Selective Service out of business. The full Senate vote on this bill should occur this coming week or the week after. If the Senate passes the bill as it now stands, the difference between the House and Senate versions will have to be resolved in conference. We are cautiously optimistic that a budget sufficient for continued operation of the system will come out of the House-Senate committee. The nation, I feel, needs the continued inexpensive insurance policy provided by the men and women of the Selective Service System. Today's Selective Service System and the extended Selective Service family that I'm sure you all have heard so much about is a proud legacy of General Hershey. He instilled a special spirit in the thousands of people who were and those who are now associated with the agency. No greater tribute could be afforded General Hershey than the recognition that his example of loyalty, leadership, devotion to duty, and respect for his people have endured to this day. I can tell you that everyone who has ever been a part of the Selective Service family is very grateful to Tri-State University. The Hershey Museum here preserves not only the memory of the man, but the significance of the agency he shaped. Within the walls of Hershey Hall, one can view artifacts and displays about a system that helped define the cost of freedom and preserve the greatest democracy in the world. So whatever fate awaits the Selective Service system in Washington during the months ahead, we will remember our friends in Angola, Indiana. Here in the heartland of America, you are preserving a small but vital piece of American history. You are the repository of many artifacts recording the history of conscription in America and documenting a system which provided 15 million men to the armed forces since 1940. I hope the special relationship between the Selective Service system and Tri-State University lasts for many years to come. Let me close my remarks by placing a new item on loan to the Hershey Museum. Chairman Gettig and Butch Pershin, would you please come forward? Thank you. 1993 is a milestone year in more ways than one. It's the 100th anniversary of General Hershey's birth, and it's also the midpoint of the nation's 5-year commemoration of the 50th anniversary of our victory in World War II. As part of that national commemoration, Army artist Peter Verasano was commissioned by the Selective Service system to paint a commemorative watercolor. We will soon unveil the painting at a formal ceremony in Washington, and it will hang in our national headquarters. We believe it would be very appropriate if the only official framed photographic copy of that painting was placed on display in the Hershey Museum, and here it is. Okay. The subject of the painting is the October 29, 1940 lottery. The painting is based on news photographs of the drawing of the first capsule by Secretary of War Stimson. President Roosevelt is shown presiding, and General Hershey, at that time a lieutenant colonel, is prominently featured. Surrounding the central image are scenes capturing a man's complete World War II Selective Service experience: registration, an order to report, appearance before a local board, examination, induction, and serving in uniform. Now, Mr. Chairman, since this photograph is federal government property, if you would please sign this hand receipt. We'll leave the photograph in the university's good care. I have a pen. We have to sign one more, so.
I'm surprised there aren't 13.
You spoke too soon.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for inviting me to help celebrate Hershey.
Thank you very much, and thanks to Selective Service and all your colleagues at Hershey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to put that in front to disturb the voice.
Okay. Bob, thank you for those comments and remarks. I'd like to call up Mr. Danny Johnson for a presentation. Danny will be speaking at Noon Talks tomorrow to our students. It's a kind of a special program we have here that's sponsored by the English department. And anyone that's staying over, please feel free to come to Best Hall 229 tomorrow to hear Danny's comments on the Selective Service. No, I think we can get through.
Okay.
Thank you, Butch. On behalf of the Lewis B. Hershey chapter of the Reserve Officers Association, and I'd also like at this very time to have the members of the Hershey chapter stand up and recognize, so that people can recognize you who are members of our chapter of the Reserve Officers Association, Hershey chapter. Could you please stand up, please? And Gilbert is back in the back too. I have just recently served as the chapter president and for the last year. It was an honor to do it. It's an honor to serve an organization that General Hershey was very important and with their building fund and having the Reserve Officers Association be a large, important organization for our nation's defense. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to present, on behalf of the Hershey chapter, a check to Tri-State University for the museum for $300.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the university, we thank your organization. I'm sorry I don't belong. Possibly you could send me a membership if it's not too expensive. No, I was very sorry that I couldn't stand up today because I don't belong to your organization. So on behalf of the university and the board and all of us here at Tri-State, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bill, I seen the application for that organization as triplicate, so...
I haven't asked the dues yet.
Tomorrow, with Danny's Noon Talks program, will be the culmination of the celebration of General Hershey's 100th birthday. I do want to remind everyone in the room that it's also a beginning of a strong relationship with the Selective Service System and Tri-State University to properly and historically document the Selective Service System. Many in this room can help in that effort, and I hope you'll do whatever you can to make it a successful effort. Now, this is going to be everyone's opportunity to be on video. So we're going to go right around the room here. I'm going to, as we go around the room, also point out a few people that helped make the program this weekend work as well as it has. I think we're going to start at this table. You're not obligated to stand up and say anything, but if you feel like you need or would like to, we'd like to have you do that. One of the people that's helped make this go, Veronica Kane, has been very instrumental in making the program go. You're going to take this microphone around to people?
Yeah, this mic does not amplify your voice, but it will go into the video camera, so we won't lose your voice recording.
This video will go into the archives, and we'll be making copies available to the family and others that are interested in having a copy of this video. We'll be the entire day's program. So we'll start right here at this table. Any comments from this group?
Just talk right in.
I married into Selective Service. Pardon? Oh, I'm John Denny. Two little stories I wanted to tell you. I got to know the General in the early 1960s, and in my book, he's one of the finest people that ever lived. It's too bad somebody hasn't written a book about the man, General Hershey. One night at a meeting, a young officer was introducing the General, and he had been furnished quite a bit of biographical information, and this young officer read every bit of it, and I think he added some things. And when the General got up to speak, he thanked him very much, and he said on occasions like this, he wondered whether this was an introduction or an obituary. Another story that he told quite frequently, he said, I was walking down Pennsylvania Avenue the other day, and I passed one of those large federal office buildings, and I met some tourists, and they asked me how many people worked in that building, and I told them about half of them.
Anyone else at this table? Let me just quickly introduce Lou Bronski, also with the Selective Service System, another good friend of Hershey.
And I just wanted to take a moment to thank a man who I feel has been instrumental in cementing the relationship, the continuing and lasting relationship between Selective Service and Tri-State University, and that's Butch Purchan.
Second table, let me quickly introduce Priscilla Wilson, who was very instrumental in putting Library 104 together, that display you saw today. And Priscilla, we really appreciate your help, and the children's help too. Inside joke service.
Cousins? Okay.
Peggy, you won't pass on this opportunity, will you?
I have not been known to, no. First of all, I'd like to say, I think you all know how honored and privileged I was to work with the General. And I worked, Danny, in a little office inside an office in the building you will be speaking in tomorrow. To emphasize what Mr. Spanagle said about the General and he's called a politician. He was a good politician. He worked under 5 presidents. He knew how to handle people. But when you went through his papers, you realized what politician meant in the General's criteria. It meant a letter to someone like President Kennedy saying he was sorry Patrick died. It was to Arleigh Burke when he was hospitalized. It was to President Eisenhower. He got letters back from these men. Some of them, some of the last ones these men wrote. Politics in the General's mind often came down to just plain kindness and the human spirit. He was sharp. His down-home manner, I think, made a lot of people underestimate him, but he was a brilliant, tough man. And when you saw the toughness shine through, you knew you were in good hands in this country. And the caliber of the people who worked with him. If you didn't know the General, you wouldn't understand why we are all so fond of the man. It wasn't just sentiment. This was a man above men who was honest, who was, anytime he got a gratuity for speaking somewhere, it went to blinded war veterans. You heard this morning why. It went to Boy Scouts, and it went to Tri-State University. He had his supreme loyalties. Let me say just something about Tri-State College. I worked here, my husband taught here, and Tri-State, first of all, the General and his people were saving history. They were saving it, and he wanted it sent here. Carlisle War College, Barracks War College wanted it. Library of Congress wanted it. He wanted it to come here to be, so that Tri-State would be the center of research with the artifacts, the memorabilia, and the Selective Service Library. He wanted this to be the research center, where not just eminent scholars would come, but the students could go over this material. And after going over the man's papers, his personal and professional, he didn't hide anything. His papers were not censored like some famous generals and some famous statesmen were, can't speak. But I'd ask him a question. If he couldn't answer it, he would refer me to Colonel Ulmer, to Colonel Ingold, to the officer, I can't recall his name, who helped with the draft on mainland China. See, we, other countries, first of all, when the General and the Joint Committee were setting up selective service, they studied other countries' methods of conscription. After selective service was set up, Israel and the other countries came here and studied our selective service. All of his papers were open, all of his information. In that collection, there were articles, there were books, there were critical items about him and about the service. It was all there. Nothing was hidden, nothing was discarded. You had pro and con. It was the most interesting research collection you can imagine. I pity anybody who didn't know the man. Mr. Gambino said he will never fill the General's shoes. Mr. Gambino should remember that the General considered himself, and he always said, I am a cog in a system. Others will come after me. They will just do just as well. And I hope and pray President Clinton realizes that about this man. To speak just a few words about Tri-State. Tri-State accepted this material that the General wanted to send here at a very chancy time. And as Mr. Flynn and Mr. Spanagle have mentioned, it was during the time ROTC buildings were being burnt down. Tri-State builds a building, puts Hershey's name on it, devotes a museum to selective service. We have guests coming in when it's set up saying, why to the draft? The draft was the Second World War. Well, of course the draft wasn't the Second World War. The draft went back to colonial England and to colonial United States. and they went away. We treated it as history, not politics, and it was accepted. But Tri-State was very courageous in taking it at that time, and there was not unanimity of purpose, I must say. Some of the threats to blow the stuff up, to burn it, and to blow the building up were not only from a few students. We had some professors who would have liked to have seen that done too. I remember going down a long, empty hallway in the best building to my room within a room. I had a key. The president of the university had a college at that time, had a key. And every now and then there'd be a briefcase in my doorway. Nobody around, just a briefcase. And I'd think, well, is this the day? But the briefcase would be gone when I'd come out. So nothing happened. The students accepted it here. The museum was well received. I am so grateful to Mr. Gambino, Mr. Brodsky, Danny Johnson, for emphasizing how important this material is to the country and to history, main thing to history. You have a treasure here, and you all realize it. And after 20 years, believe me, my poor old heart is very happy about this. And going back to just one point of security, if you notice the lottery bowl behind that pillar, Joe put it there because we didn't want any missiles to hit the bowl, the only bowl. So, and thank you for inviting us. We loved Angola, we loved Tri-State, we loved our old house, even though they've changed it, and we are delighted to be here. Thank you, Butch.
At the next table, I want to recognize Marielle McGregor, who has served on the committee to organize all this, and is our only casualty. Marielle, you're a casualty at the end? Very good.
You know that I had asked people to, on the invitation list, if they would like to respond in any way if they cannot be here. And I have a few letters I just want to, and phone calls I'd like to tell people about, okay? Would you like to talk a minute while I come? No. A lady named Bernice Brodkin worked with the Selective Service for 26 years. She worked in the finance division, and she recorded the numbers during the '69 lottery. And she wished to share with the family that she felt that those were many wonderful years, and that she believed that the agency was one of the best places anyone could work. Beryl Blake worked under D. Ingold, and she did not know General Hershey, but she loved him because of all of the memories that the others shared with her and the people who had worked with the general. And she said that everyone held him in the highest regard. She worked in the Legislative Liaison Office. She's in South Dakota now, and she wanted to be remembered. Dorothy Masselhose wrote to Tri-State College, "I was born under a lucky star that pulled me from the state of Kansas in 1939 to go to Washington, D.C., where I went to work for the War Department in G1 for a then Major Hershey. It was my privilege to have been with him for 6.5 years while the system was formed. He rose from major to major general. He was truly a leader of men, one with vision, strength, discipline, humor, and compassion." Edna Wright worked, she says, I worked 17 years at Selective Service in Washington, D.C., National Headquarters, and they were the best years of my life. I retired in 1973, along with a lot of others, and still keep my memories of those good years in my mind. I have a box full of things pertaining to work and programs that we all enjoyed, and letters and cards, too, from so many, including the General and his daughters. Joe Tiagno is one of our trustees, and he called me about a month ago and said, "I wish I could be there, but I just want to tell you that the General was as great a gentleman as I've ever known," quote unquote.
and that they were a delightful couple. He talked a lot about your mom, Ellen, and he said she was a doll. He said that the general was the humblest, hardest working man in government. He's confident of that he fulfilled his job better than anyone could have, and he bore the burden of his job very well. Edeline Henderson says, the 18 years I spent from 1955 until 1973 in General Hershey's employment were the most happy ones, to say the least. He was adored by all who worked for him. A great general he was.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Ellen?
Okay, we're one of the family tables here now.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I want to say he was a devoted father, first of all. I know that. But he was also a very sentimental husband. Mother used to get a rose for every year they were married. So they got to 59 roses, which was pretty good. And also I want to mention this necklace with a pendant on it. It says September 10th, 1907. Then it says 1969 on the bottom. Dad gave it to Mother. That was 62 years since they met, the first day of the 7th grade. So he always remembered it. Thank you.
Okay.
You too shy here, George?
No, he keeps it.
Okay. Tri-State Day, we're here. This next day, we'll need to recognize a few people. Ralph Martin, who is an emeritus person here at Tri-State University, serving on our committee to organize this activity. Jim Zimmerman, next to Ralph, a professor of history here at Tri-State, really headed the committee up. And we have Billy Sunday, an emeritus member of Tri-State University, also serving on the committee. And we certainly appreciate your efforts.
Butch, can I say a few words?
Yes,
first, I hate to hear anybody congratulate you. You're hard enough to get along with as it is. Stay right there.
Okay.
Sorry. Recollection of the general, and that's the way you've heard the tri-state people talk to him. It was not General Hershey, it was the general. I had the privilege of quite often picking him up when he was coming in for the trustee meetings, either at the railroad depot or at the airport, and taking him back sometimes to the Holiday Inn. I remember when I first met him, we were going from the Trout Club, and this is where the trustees were meeting at that time over by Fremont. And he was asking me, he says, Mr. Martin, are you an old-time resident of Steuben County? Or are you a lately come Johnny? And I said, no, I've lived here all my life. He proceeded to tell me about dating one of my aunts, taking her home in a buggy, and my father, who was just a baby at that time, crying. He didn't need any prodding along. His memory served him well. When my wife and I visited him in Washington, I was reminding Commander Denny today that we'd met her there, and she said, he gave you his car to and chauffeur to show you around Washington, didn't he? And I said, yes, he did. His sense of humor, I think, was very, very sharp. He was talking at a joint service club meeting in January or February here in Angola with the Kiwanis, the Lions Club, and the Rotary. And, of course, at that time his eyesight was very bad, and he was speaking right off the cuff. And it wasn't a talk with a message. It was just humor of his recollection of things that had gone on in this small rural community. And tears were flowing down people's cheeks at just laughing. And one of the presidents of one of the service clubs said, "General, there's a group of protesters outside of the cafeteria." And the general says, "Well, invite them in." Says, "It's cold out there." And this was a general. He had self-confidence. He didn't worry about what they might say or act. We were going back to Toledo one day, and as you all know, a conversation was never any shortcoming of the general. As Ellen reminded me this afternoon that he could carry any conversation along, but I did break in one time, and I said, "General, of all the presidents you have served with, which one do you think was in the best interest of the country?" Now, the general didn't know my politics, nor did I know his at that time, but he was a true diplomat. He said, "Well, that's kind of like Ralph asking whether Gene Tunney could knock out Jack Dempsey." And then he proceeded to go on and said that there are a number of people in this country that think the intellectuals, and he's referring to the Harvard people and the Kennedys, that the intellectuals have the answer for everything. Because then, he says, getting a girl upside down in a car in the water, he says, that's a different matter.
I'll take this.
Thank you very much.
I have an excerpt from a letter. This is a brief excerpt, which I think might be of interest to the family members and to all friends of Louis Hershey. This is Louis Hershey, the student, not the general. This letter is from a 1912 student, female student, contemporary of Louis Hershey, and was written in 1970. Bob Ramsey, who was the alumni director, forwarded this letter to General Hershey, who responded back to Bob Ramsey and requested opportunity to write to this student, which I think goes in line with what I hear about his caring attitude. And I won't read all the letter, but I'll read the Hershey part. She says, "Some of us girls wanted to get a basketball team, and Louis Hershey agreed to be our coach. He was always so pleasant and agreeable, one of the most popular students on campus. We weren't such great athletes, but guess what they called us? Hershey's Chocolates." Now, what I know about the general would suggest that if the Indiana National Guard had not gotten in the way, that George Flynn's book would have been about Louis B. Hershey, the coach. And the people in Indiana could care less about Bobby Knight.
Anybody else? Which table do you want now? Back here?
Okay, another family table. We got
Kitty?
Kitty over here.
I guess I get up. Well, can you hear me all right? We've heard so much about the traditional man of his time, the conservative, Republican, honest, loyal, hardworking, all the old-fashioned virtues. And we remember him that way, too. But for your information, I'm his oldest child. Name is Kitty Hershey Lane. And now I think of Dad as about 2 generations ahead of himself. Today, he would be a model for the modern parent. There was nothing around the house he wouldn't put his hand to. Diapers and child care, housework, laundry, ironing, cooking. Every morning, Mother got her cup of coffee in bed.
Let's hear for the general.
So there was this combination of old-time thoughtfulness and all this new up-to-date household sharing. He, as a father, he advised us with our homework. He met with our teachers when we were in trouble. He got up at night with a sick child. He read the classics. The first one I remember was Swiss Family Robinson and all the Kipling poems. He loved them. His children will never forget them. And they can all quote, I'm sure, all those rolling cadences that they heard practically in the cradle. Long before selective service, he was an exceptional father. And even when the war came and he was terribly busy with a crisis every day, he still had time for his children, for any problems, and volunteered ways to make their life easier. So I speak of this aspect with personal knowledge, and you don't realize how exceptional a man is when you benefit from knowing him in infancy. And I'd just like to make another note because it's something that kind of brings you up to date. I think Dad never made a cent writing his memoirs. He never took money for a speech that I know of. He felt that this was all part of his job, even after he retired. So in almost every way, he was, of course, the progenitor of the selective service system in war and in peace. He was the family head for the countrywide draft organization and for the Hershey children and grandchildren. He was knowledgeable, supportive, delightful, witty, and always a loving father, a man for all seasons and a man for all times.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Rick Lane. I am Kitty's son, the oldest grandson, oldest grandchild, I guess. If he were here tonight, he would probably start out by saying, I used to go along with speeches, tell a story perhaps about lions and Christians, where Christians were being thrown to the lions and being eaten. Suddenly one Christian was thrown in with the lions and whispered something in their ear, and the lion shrank back in horror. And then when the emperor, Roman emperor, called the Christian up wanting to know how he had saved his life, I simply told him, there'll be speeches after dinner. He, I think, has been touched upon, wrote letters. Those of us who had a birthday, graduated from high school or college, and those of us who went in the service were sure to get a letter on our birthday or on our graduation, and those of us who were away from home in the service would get a letter every Sunday. He wrote every Sunday. And if I might, I thought it might be useful to share some of the letters that I got, just a couple of them, which touch on some of the things that Mr. Flynn talked about and maybe some others. In talking about school, he said, in the process of going to school, there are probably no time that suddenly a whole encyclopedia of information becomes available to us. It is a long, laborious, and only partially successful project that we engage in. The process of learning goes on each day regardless of where we are, and we are separating one period from another is probably a convenience of the school authorities rather than marking any usual change in the student. I do not want in any way to discount the fact that we pass certain milestones in life, even as we do in driving on the road. And I think sometimes in our busy civilization, if we could call it either a civilization or a busy one, we have too few holidays, too few times that we take note of the periods in our life of others and that are starting or ending, as the case may be. In another case, I think he talked about the world today is in its material aspects is greatly different from the world that I have known. I could be amazed at the miracle performances of mechanical contrivances that take us places we may or may not want to go and get us home either when we arrive, when we want to arrive, or at some few minutes later, which in our former experiences was of little consequence, has come to be of major importance since we plan on keeping to some schedule, whether there's any reason for us to do so or not. The thing I think I find not too different are the people. I realize that their outward appearances may be different. Much of their technique of behavior is perhaps attuned to the times, but fundamentally I do not see that human nature has been affected materially by the years. It is true that more people are allegedly educated now than formerly. There would probably be a debate on whether this is good or bad. There is a wider diffusion of figures, but many times the figures conceal the facts rather than contain them. So that I am not pessimistic about human beings. I do not think they are taking our times to the dogs. I would be more likely to agree that our times have been taken to the dogs all the time anyway. So about the human race, I am optimistic, not because of its achievements or its quality or its qualifications, but it has endured a very long time, and I see no reason to anticipate an early termination. Finally, a letter. I was going into the Navy, and he wanted to send me a few words about leadership. I shall set down for reference the things I often say briefly when I talk of leadership. I use the word walk. W is for work, for which I think should be first in any explanation of what one must do to lead. Whether work has any inherent capacity for leadership, I would not venture, but it would not create many things in the individual which he could not use and is probably keeps him in condition. A is for adaptability, for rolling with the punches, for being able to become a part of different organizations under widely different circumstances. To be a member of the team and always try to carry a little more than what would be normal share of the load, because leaders always must. L is for loyalty. There is much always said on loyalty to those above you, but I would have always emphasized that there is more mileage in loyalty to subordinates than anything I know. The individuals for which you are responsible will always give far more than they receive. One of the reasons, it is the field in which one competes with individuals who do not understand this, and therefore they are able to show interest in their subordinates before their subordinates have much opportunity to show interest in them. And I repeat, there is no effort that a leader makes which pays off more anywhere near the dividends of the things that he does for his subordinates and looking out for their welfare, and many times merely recognizing each of them as an individual. There is also the question of loyalty to those with whom you are associated, who are neither your leaders nor your followers. Again, there again, I believe loyalty is one of the best investments I know. K is for knowledge, which probably none of the others would be too important, but leaders must know their jobs. I do believe there is some necessity in selectivity of knowledge, because all the knowledge of any operation is possible, and while knowledge should be sufficient to understand the problem and its elements of it, to plan for its solution, it is possible to have knowledge and use it, unfortunately, by trying to interfere with everybody else's job under you, merely because you understand it. Supervision without meddling is one of the most difficult operations we perform. At this point, he would probably say, tell a story about a young man who asked a girl for the last dance, and she says, "You've had it." And with that, he would say, "And you've probably had enough of me tonight."
Thank you. Introduce yourself too. I'm Rosalind Beard, and my father served with General Hershey in National Guard and field artillery, and then down on the Mexican border. And anytime General Hershey was in Angola, he usually would look up our family. And I want to tell you one thing about General Hershey had a brother, Russ Hershey. And they had no children, but they did have a dog. And when Russ was elected sheriff of Steuben County, why, he didn't have a place for the dog in the jail. So he asked my father if he would take the dog to our farm. And, of course, my dad said yes, and we had Tiny on our farm. Well, then in the newspaper, they were wanting dogs to serve in the Army, and I think go up mountains and take supplies and maybe ammunition, I'm not sure. But so Dad asked Russ if he'd like to send the dog to the Army to be trained. And, of course, he said, sure, send him to the Army. So the dog was taken, and then when the war was over, we got a letter if they'd like to have the dog returned, and they said certainly. And they said they would have to train the dog to be gentle, and the dog was a collie dog, and it trained back real well. And when Russ had come up in the courthouse, the dog had just
be right at his heel. And he kept the dog then after it was returned from the Army. Another time I wanted to say something was General Hershey would stop in the auditor's office, and Dad and I was standing there just visiting, and my father was a man that if any woman had a son in the Army or Navy or Air Force or whatever, he would ask questions, and every mother likes to talk about her sons. So he'd say, stop in and when he's home, and I want to meet him. So General Hershey was in the office this day just visiting, and my gosh, here come this young boy just out of basic training, about 19 years old, lean and tan, and here stood this four-star general, and this boy and his mother, and the poor boy just wanted to run. But he did salute the general, and right away the general said, "At ease, son, at ease." And but that boy just hopped from one foot to the other. He couldn't wait to get out of there. But I'll bet his mother heard about it, and I doubt if when he got back to camp, if anybody would believe him that he met a four-star general. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody here?
While I was in the service in the United States, I was stationed at Fort Belvoir in Virginia, which is just south of Washington. And my home, away from home, on the weekends that I was able to get a pass, was at the General Hershey's house. And General Hershey and Mrs. Hershey made me feel like a member of the family. And of course, I am a cousin to George and and Gilbert and Kitty, and but it was a wonderful experience. And I probably had a dozen interesting vignettes that I could repeat, but it was more to the point to say that I was very delighted to be invited here and share and listen to the stories that you people have to say. But I had some wonderful experiences at the Hershey home in Washington while I was in Fort Belvoir.
Thank you.
We've got two people at this table we need to recognize. Joe and Sharon, would you stand up? Joe has come up from Fort Wayne and volunteered to do a lot of work for us. Would you stand up there? Good. And Sharon Martin is our Director of Alumni Relations, and this summer she stepped in to the void and helped quite a bit. We appreciate your help, Sharon.
I just briefly want to say that it has been a wonderful opportunity for me to have been involved in this project. And I especially want to recognize once again the leadership role that Priscilla Wilson and Marcia Hooker have taken in terms of putting together the exhibit in Library Room 104. The countless hours that they shared, it's been full of many, many memories, wonderful memories, and I really wish to thank you very, very much. I also wish once again, too, it has been a wonderful privilege for me to get to know Jo Wilson. Jo Wilson worked in the Selective Service, and it has been wonderful to get to know her and for her to share a little bit of the life of this remarkable man. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity.
I'd like to introduce Louis B. Hershey, the second. You have to say something.
I have to say something?
Your dad said. You're gentle.
First time he's ever been lost for words.
This is hardly fair. Well, I want to first thank everyone here for the honor and recognition that they have given all of the family. I wish I could say something to you of the experiences you lived, other than the fact that people of my generation, who are so different in so many ways, owe such a debt to the success of the vision that both my grandfather and all of you, lived in putting your lives on the line through 3 wars, events of which we could not possibly understand because of your success. The world has changed so much. If there is a hope for the kind of value that has been passed on in this room, it will be that we don't forget, not just men and women, but ideas, that you can better yourselves from continuing to try harder. I cannot speak for the experiences you've had. I don't know the story that people even like my cousin Rick has shared with you, because I am much younger than all of you. But if I could pass on a legacy to those who would be much younger than I, it would be to look to the kinds of models that my grandfather and his family have impressed upon me. I did not ask to be named after my grandfather, and it has provided me with a certain amount of celebrity that I did not earn. I am no more my grandfather's grandson than any of his children's children are, their grandsons and granddaughters. But I am proud to be a member of that family, and proud to have each and every one of them members of my family. Thank you very much.
I'd like to claim that he's a chip off the old block, but I don't know whether I can quite measure up. Maybe he's a chip off of his grandfather's block. I appreciate very much all of the fine things that I've heard tonight from all of you. I feel greatly flattered that you brought me here to tell me these things. I thank all of you for the support that you are continuing to give General Louis B. Hershey, because certainly he's one of our greatest Americans, and I'm talking about all of them from the colonial times until now. If we can live by the example that he has set, our country will continue to be strong and ready for all that it must do for the world civilization. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanking me for coming to his birthday party, which was hosted by the Hershey Chapter ROA. As I recall, this was his last such birthday party before his death. It struck me then, as it does now, as being another example of our great and ever-gracious General Louis B. Hershey, who still would, long after he had retired, take the time to write to thank a member of his selective service family. It came from the heart. I feel sure if he could use heaven's overnight delivery, he would be sending everyone at the Tri-State University Commemoration of the 100th anniversary of his birth this message. Thank you, my friends, for remembering my birthday. Sincerely, Dorothy S. Alway. Danny, come on.
This is a letter to the family and friends of General Louis B. Hershey from Evan L. Holtman, Major General, AUS, retired, the Executive Director of the Reserve Officers Association in Washington, D.C., who is out of the country and unable to attend, and he did send this letter along to be read at the function here tonight. And it reads as follows: on the centennial anniversary of General Louis B. Hershey's birthday, it is a privilege and an honor for me to send both personal and Reserve Officers Association of the United States greetings to all of those present to honor this great American patriot. I was one of those millions who entered the service in World War II during General Hershey's stewardship as Director of the Selective Service System. I later had the privilege of meeting and knowing him personally. The Reserve Officers Association of the United States owes a great debt to our friend, General Hershey, for the mentor role which he played in our association at the time we were seeking voluntarily funds to build our Minuteman Memorial at number 1 Constitution Avenue on Capitol Hill. General Hershey's contribution to this effort was both unique and monumental. It is ironic that at this very time we are in the struggle to preserve the system which General Hershey developed and administered with great foresight, dedication, and skill. This is proof of the ancient adage that challenges of freedom is eternal. I am taking the liberty of enclosing a copy of our 1993 Midwinter Banquet and Military Ball program. You will note that the picture immediately across the page from the banquet program is one of the cornerstone dedication to our building on February 23, 1967, wherein ROA President Major General Horace B. Hanson, Jr. and General Hershey, the Building Fund Chairman, dedicated the cornerstone. Over 100,000 reserve officers of the United States joined me in saluting a friend of many and a mentor of all patriots. Respectively signed, Evan L. Haltman, Major General, a U.S. retired Executive Director.
On behalf of the trustees, faculty, and staff at Tri-State University, I thank George Flynn, Bob Spinogle, Bob Gambino, members of the Selective Service, the Hershey family, and friends who shared this evening with us. I hope you'll be with us tomorrow for Danny's speech. And again, thank you for coming tonight. It was really a memorable evening. Good night.